Hello, remote people. Can you hear us?
Yes, we can. Good morning.
Sebastian?
Yes, we can hear you.
We can't hear you.
Oh. I hear you.
We can't hear you, which may be at our end. Hold on.
Yeah. 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2.
Try again, Sebastian.
1 2 1 2.
Very good. Thank you.
Thanks.
1 2.
Yep.
Does it work? Okay, great. Good morning.
Fantastic. We're going to mute for a few minutes and we'll start fairly soon.
Sure.
Where do we find the Meet Echo URL?
It's in the materials page for the meeting. So if you go to data tracker.
Except it's still wrong.
No, I just followed it.
I just clicked on it and it says the room was going to open in 3 hours.
So if you go to
Session 3?
upcoming meetings, upcoming meetings.
Oh, sorry, wait a minute.
Data tracker, upcoming meetings or meetings.
Oh, I'm on
The morning meeting will be the first one.
And it's session 3.
So it's in the materials, not the Meet Echo link. Because there's
Meet Echo
the
link.
link you got sent in email is wrong.
It shouldn't be,
It's for the city, okay.
Yeah.
Well,
but it's per
Oh,
session.
I got it.
Right.
Okay.
So, yeah, MediaEcho has some constraints which we're going to give robust feedback about very soon.
But you're right, yeah, if you go through upcoming meetings, it seems to be.
And the link for this afternoon's session has changed. You should have seen an email about that recently. And that may be the one you're referring to, actually. That was for this afternoon's session. We asked them to have the start time moved in case we finish lunch earlier. We move lunch around, but we don't have to wait around for the session to start like we did yesterday a little bit. So let's get started. Remote folks, you can't hear us, correct? No audio yet, thanks.
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. Fantastic. Thank you. You're very kind. So yesterday we did an introduction and we had a long talk about the vocabulary. I feel like we made some progress. So we'll issue a call for adoption soon. And we'll also create an issues list so we can start focusing those discussions on those particular issues. Today, we had originally scheduled to start with talking about attachment, but as we kind of mused yesterday, we were thinking maybe it'd be interesting to time box that discussion and make sure that we reserve more time for continuing the discussion of vocabulary, because it seems like the face-to-face time is really valuable for the very foundational vocabulary discussions. And I guess the question is whether we want to continue vocabulary now and keep that momentum, or have the attachment discussion and then go back to vocabulary. Any thoughts?
Vocabulary.
Start with vocabulary. So why don't we use at least an hour or two this morning on vocabulary, and then we'll switch to attachment. Make sense?
You got a comment online, because there's no audio yet.
Yeah, but Mike then subsequently said.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah. So yes.
Sorry.
Yes, thank you. We do once again need a volunteer to take notes in the hedge doc
For the first 2 hours?
for the first 2 hours. Yeah, smaller commitment.
Joe looks very excited to do it.
Tell me how to?
Are you on the meeting chat?
Yeah.
Okay, let me post it there.
Thank you for rising to the occasion. And we also have one new participant in the room. Sarah, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, hi, I'm Sarah Jennings. I'm from the Department of Science, Innovation and Technology in UK Government.
Sorry, I missed that last one.
UK Government.
UK Government.
And I'm wondering if we should whip around the room and have everyone else introduce each other, both
I
for
think
Sarah.
there's somebody else, like, yeah,
Did I miss someone else?
no, somebody else didn't introduce himself.
Well, I think that let's go around the room just because there are still new faces and it helps reinforce. So Mark Nottingham, Cloudflare, but here working group chair.
Suresh Krishnan, Cisco, similar, chair.
Leonard Rosenthal, Adobe, and C2PA.
There's Timid Robot with Creative Commons.
Hirotsuka from Prefab Networks. Yali AIPREF Research.
Ted Hardy, unaffiliated.
I'm trying to embed the
Colin Miller, spawning.
Mia Kudelin, Ericsson Research.
Joseph Bradley, Tony Blair Institute.
Sarah, you've done your work.
Brad Silva, Advanced Conde Nast.
One Comcast MHC, Universal Sky.
Hello, Future.
City the Microsoft.
Gary, Google.
Microsoft.
Great. And online, Mike?
Mike Bishop, Akamai, here as responsible AD.
Sebastian?
Good morning, Sebastian Post, Elysium.
Lovely. And who else do we
Brian.
have? Brian?
Brian Newbold, Blue Sky.
Lovely, thank you. And who else? Pierce?
Pierce.
Hi, Peter Hanlon, BBC Research.
Lovely. And Stefano?
Stefano Gentile, European Commission.
Lovely, thank you. Welcome, everyone. Did I miss anyone online? Hopefully not. Okay, great. So just a reminder, please do speak up when you're speaking. so that the remote folks can hear you, and please avoid the side conversations and talking over each other. Okay, so yesterday we identified a set of issues for discussion around the vocabulary. We talked about kind of that interface to attachment, talking about having an abstract model, but then a recommended or suggested serialization for use in common places. And this is not good. Okay, thank you. And then we also talked about the carve out for search and discovery, and we seemed at the end of that discussion to be inclined to include search in our discussions and figure out a way to offer preferences for search use cases and perhaps different aspects of search in our discussion. So that's going to be a considerable area for discussion, I think.
You want me to throw that up, Mark? I just threw up the.
Oh, lovely. Thank you. Very good.
I think perhaps we should talk to something that's a little bit adjacent there, which is the kind of RAG inference time and agents use cases. So let's start there. What do people think? In Paul's proposal, which we're going to do a call for adoption for, and as he discussed yesterday, there isn't any accommodation for these use cases. All right, Ted, could I ask you to close the doors? Oh, thank you, Ted. Thank you. Any preliminary thoughts? Paul?
Yeah, maybe for the benefit of rehashing that, sort of like I gave 3 reasons why they were not yesterday. Like I think 2 of them are, well, we can ignore them. One, it was sort of came up as an issue too late in the discussions that inspired the document that became a draft. The second, the one that really stays in here is that it is a bit undefined what people are talking about when it's like, I think it mixes pretty much every use of online assets, copyrighted works that happen after the model has trained by AI systems into one category. Like I think RAG is relatively well defined. Some people understand, I think, forms of search to be included there. There's these, if I provide, as a user of the system, provide works as input into a system, for example, I want something translated. And I think if we wanted to include that under the condition that we want to move relatively fast and propose something, then very early in the process, we need to have a definition of which part of this we want to address and which part maybe we're not feeling comfortable to address. But I feel like there's a lot of uncertainty around this. This is sort of like has the potential to slow us down quite a bit because like there's what about this scenario? What about that scenario? Dangers or.
Can I ask you a question? After the conversation we had yesterday and reading the drafts, what is it about limiting or expanding the list of use cases, like what we address, right? Search, non-search, all that kind of stuff, that impacts the vocabulary itself in a way that really slows things down. That part I'm not understanding, I think, at this point. We had that great conversation yesterday. Does that question make sense? I can try framing it differently.
It does, but that is the vocabulary. So in other words, if you think about it, the vocabulary are the things that you can opt in or opt out of. So, so there's the basic, like training was the sort of our starting point, but search, discovery, inference, RAG, these are all possible additions to the vocabulary.
Yes.
So therefore, we have to discuss at least whether they're part of the initial vocabulary. I mean, we agreed that the vocabulary could evolve over time, but we at least need a starting point for that vocabulary. What is that starting point?
So let me refine my question. So after the great discussion we had yesterday, and the discussion that I'm sure will happen later on this, is that not just now a set of proposals that will come in? Right, if we adopt the base vocabulary proposal we have today, there'll be a series of discussions that will modify it, extending it, modifying it. I like to have these 3 terms. No, I like to take those 3 terms out. That's a normal discussion. Does it really hold us up to sort of say, okay, now the floor is open, make your proposals for additions and removals, and then we just proceed from there, as if we would normally with any kind of grammar. We'd argue about what goes in, what goes out. Do we need to make a hard decision? And I'm sort of asking the chairs, is this the time you feel we need to make a hard decision on what's in and what's out, or can we just let it evolve organically over the next 2 months?
I think the idea is like, what is the smallest subset we can start with, right, and then go from there. But I think Mark, like,
Yeah, absolutely. We just, because our time scale is so compressed, if we're going to realistically include things that are sizable, and I do think that, if we include these cases, it's going to require a fair amount of discussion. We need to start that discussion very soon.
So then, let me play that back. So since we have a first time scale, the approach might be do a minimum set by August, and then are we envisioning that post-August, we would do a standard set in like 2026?
I think that is entirely possible. I think that it depends. Certainly there's a will to do that, and that is one path we can take. But there are some dependencies there. We have to stay engaged with the policymaker communities to make sure that they're still paying attention, that they don't think that we're just shipping something and then that's done. And there has to be an appetite for that. As Alyssa said yesterday, I don't think she's online yet, but as Alyssa said, this isn't necessarily a one-shot deal, but there is a risk that we ship something and then people's attention moves on, and we kind of lose the opportunity to get it in front of people.
That never happened.
Well,
it definitely will happen.
Yeah.
So okay, let me do that. I'm calling your so because I'll get asked these questions back. So it sounds like there's a set of processes that this is feeding into on the policy front for various policy bodies that are looking for an answer, and if they don't hear it from us with an answer, they may commission a different answer by other parties.
I'll put a finer point on that. We are offering an answer. They may decide not to take it.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. And in the current, okay, yeah, I'm done.
Okay.
No, Kirsten is in the queue, but if you're in the room, please join the Meet Echo queue so it's easier. Like I know Sonia, you probably don't have a data tracker account, but we didn't talk about it. But get in the queue, but you're next in line, so please go ahead.
Thanks. Agree with not including inferencing because of the unknown impact that would have and the protracted discussion around the possible scenarios. I think TDM as a broad category raises the same concerns actually, as well as broadly AI training. I think if we start with generative AI training, that seems to be where the main concern is, and what we should tackle first. And then we can have the discussion around the impact of AI training as well as other examples of TDM provided.
Yeah, a little bit of a counterposition on that. I think that AI training certainly seems to be, or generative AI training seems to be the simplest, most straightforward target to tackle for sure, and could probably get us to a point in a quicker amount of time. I don't think that skipping over RAG would be a great step in terms of tackling the concerns, at least from the publishing community's perspective. I think RAG is the #1 concern, and it is the #1 knot that we're tied up in terms of how to be able to signal that we don't want it to be crawled for RAG purposes. It doesn't seem to me, but I'm not a deeply technical person, so that definitionally the idea of what RAG is today is that fuzzy. I do understand that there are potential implications of anything that occurs post-training that could be complicated. But I think that applies to everything that can happen post-training. RAG seems to be, to me, the single most thing that happens post-training that has caused the most amount of consternation from where I sit. And in terms of the work of this group being relevant and being bold and being able to at least attempt a solution, it may be that we get to a point where we say there are too many questions and we need to pull back and focus on the questions that we can solve for now. But you know, I'd imagine that if it was the outcome of this discussion right now, that we were not going to focus on RAG, and that would be a phase 2 potentially post-August or 2026. That would be quite a blow for the publishing news and magazine community. So I hope that we can figure out a way to get our arms around it, or at least try to get our arms around it in a pragmatic way.
I think one of the things that may be causing us a little bit of focus issues is the point that Leonard was making yesterday, that we're very robots like TXT focused. As we think about this, we have the acquisition of the data, we have the analysis of the data, and we have the actions or the use of the data. I think the IETF started doing this because the standard for the robots exclusion protocol got published year after its original publication. And it's about the acquisition side. And so the vocabulary around the acquisition side can be derived from the robots exclusion protocol, and although it's not complete, there's at least a set of templates we could build upon that are relatively easy. So from a kind of a mental model perspective, it's there. I think the other sorts of container or stream type attachments, we can kind of reconfigure our mental model to say, imagine you got these, and in each of these cases, they came with a clause that says, you can use this if, or you can't use this unless. And that's our kind of opt-in, opt-out. So I think as we think through the vocabulary, we always have to be thinking, what kind of clause is it going to appear? And what kind of promise are we expecting somebody to make about them carrying this imposition onward? So from my perspective, we have the case where the person who's doing the acquisition, the person who's doing the analysis, and the person who's making the action is all one large organization, all parts of Google, all parts of Microsoft. But that's not the only case, right? We have Common Crawl, which is the source of a whole bunch of this data in terms of acquisition, but it's not necessarily doing either of the two later steps. So what we need for there is vocabulary not necessarily that allows the yes, if, or the no, unless to be executed by the same person, but the clause is actually, and I promise to carry this forward to the people who come to me for the next steps. So I think as we think about this, that structure is important because it gets to when is this going to happen in the pipeline? Is it a discrete step where somebody does the analysis, presents the action, and you're done? Or during the course of the action, does the analysis recur? And that's the RAG or other at execution time, bring in new data and rerun the analysis piece. And I think we probably want to make sure that means everybody who's doing this understands what we mean when we say you must carry this forward. So that part of the vocabulary needs to be brutally clear. And that it doesn't treat it as a single pipeline. Because if we do treat it as a single pipeline, which I've been doing in the conversations up till now, we're not going to be able eventually to create the later vocabulary that handles in the middle of the action, we went back and did the analysis, or went back and did some acquisition and analysis, and now we're representing the results. So I think we have to treat it as a system where those three things can happen multiple times, but every time they happen, the people have to recheck whether they're meaning that yes, if, no, unless clause, and if they're not, they have to stop. Or if they're choosing to obey the preferences, they will list.
Fine.
So quickly on that one, I think, yes, I agree with you, although I think some of the issues are not vocabulary issues, but rather the vocabulary needs to be able to communicate these things, and I think it needs to also formulate an expectation that this information is carried by anyone operating within this ecosystem. But that, towards the end, we're going into enforcement, which I think is a little bit sort of lives elsewhere. I wanted to come back on sort of my initial intervention was what drove us to not include this in the paper I presented yesterday. I want to make the case for actually including a use at inference time / RAG thing, because I also I think I see what you're describing, that this is a very important concern on, especially on the publishers, but I think more broadly, right? So the communities to some degree, and it will sort of, when we presented this thing, when we were published, that was the #1 question we got: why are you not saying anything to users that occur after training, right? Like that's the obvious, I think we have to, if we want to present this as something that addresses the sort of like that tries to really solve the problems that people are facing. Another reason is that I think there is also entities out there which have something like that. I think OpenAI operates 2 different crawlers at the moment. One is GPT user and the other one is called OpenAI bot or something. They get a bit confused with naming their crawlers, but they differentiate between like the GPT user thing is, I think, the one which fetches things in response to sort of like instructions from the user. I think CP2A has the inference category in there. I think there's a number of other elements who implement this, and so from the ambition to standardize in this space and not have like lots of different, okay, like everything else is standardized, but we leave this open, like would also sort of fail the conceptual objective of creating a vocabulary in this space. So for me, one of the questions is a little bit, maybe that's something to Leonard, is sort of what you call RAG and what you call inference. Is that the same? Is that just similar, or sort of are there really differences between these things? Or is this just sort of like a bit of confusion on the side of naming conventions at the moment?
Eric?
Yeah. So walking into this room, at least my initial position was that, yeah, maybe this is better left for later. The most biggest thing is the actual model training, and this is sort of not as important. May change my opinion during the discussion, probably will. But let me just justify why I thought so. The first point is about user point of view, and this isn't just about publishers and large internet or AI companies. It's about what end users do. I, as an end user, actually want to point my tools to 1,000 documents and tell me, some answers to questions that I have about those documents. How often it isn't about recreating the documents; it's about indeed some answers or some, answering questions. And if we put the same burden on those end users as we put on the big AI companies, then what will happen is that me, the end user, will not be able to do this thing, and I can only use the tooling from the large AI company. And I think that would be an unfortunate state of affairs for the world. And the second reason why I think this is maybe challenging is that we've been talking about the RAG, but it's not just about RAG. It's like a huge space of things between what the publishers would actually be afraid of. Like, let's take everything from New York Times and stick it into the RAG, and then we can use it to replicate what New York Times is saying, to like end user prompting things, like even copy pasting stuff into the prompt. And So there's many things. Practice is one thing. What about large context sizes? They've been increasing by I don't know how many orders of magnitude per year. Now we're up to 10 million or 10 million. You don't need RAG necessarily. You can just stick content in many cases. So where do we actually draw the line? Like if I type something, or if I copy paste, or where is it? And each of those choices is going to be challenging. Or if we name a particular technique like RAG, it's just a technique. There's like 50 other techniques and more next year, right? So it's not a very stable definition in my opinion. So in this opposition, maybe you should leave it out and be explicit that we don't include that. But of course, it is easy to add later.
Good point, Gary, but like I think it's really about usage, right? Like, more than RAG, it's really about usage. I think if we can somehow go on a definition that way, I think it might be more tractable. Pierce?
Oh, hi. Yeah. I mean, I think that maybe one should think about really talking about RAG. It's basically just inference, isn't it? Really, the sort of we user time, and it's basically filling the model context with something that's relevant to what the user has prompted the item with. But I think one of the key things about the sort of inference side thing is the sort of the value proposition around that type of material, because typically we're talking about stuff that has just been published, has just arrived on the internet. So the timely aspect of that information being taken in by the model into the context and used and then sort of reinterpreted for the user is I think makes it critical, because it's, I mean, at the end of the day, I guess it's a sort of time windowing sort of machine, in that you feed a large chunk of data training from maybe potentially sort of a long time ago, and then you maybe fine tune it on slightly newer stuff, and then you ultimately, if anyone's talking about any kind of real time events or events that are happening in the very recent future, the training isn't going to be part of that because it takes much longer, I guess, at this stage. But I think the key is that inference is important. Inference time information is important because of its sort of timeliness, and that makes it more valuable at that time. Once it's then sort of used later for training, it may not be as valuable. I think, say, for example, whatever news organizations, that's why it's so critical, really. And I'm not sure if that's really captured sort of that timeliness aspect. That's really my point.
Leonard, so I think you hit it. You said it well, and I think it goes to some of what I was going to talk about, which is that it's really not about is it RAG, it's that usage, and I think that goes to very clearly why inference is even a topic. So some of the rationale is that it happens to be one of the options present in the C2PA AI preferences functionality. And the reason that we introduced it there, and to my knowledge, we're the only ones that have it as an option at this point, was based on actual user requests. So, and I mentioned this yesterday, at Adobe, our creatives are very concerned about people using their assets for what we call style referencing. So they don't want people to be able to say, take an image that they posted off the net, drag it down and say, make me something like this. They don't want people copying their styles. And a lot of that happened very early on in the generative AI world, and still continues. We used the Studio Ghibli example yesterday. So it was a very clear request from our customer base, and continues to be, and it's something that we've implemented and support within our products at this time. So if that flag happens to be set in an asset with a C2PA manifest, we respect it and we don't allow it to be used for style referencing. And our customers, as I said, are very happy about that. But again, whether you call that inference or not, it's a very clear use case. It happens at inference time, which is why we gave it that term originally. On the other hand, and I think a good example was given around summarization. Brad, you were talking about that. We don't treat that in the same way. So again, giving you an example in Acrobat's AI assistant, where we will summarize an open document. If that document had inference, no, we will still summarize it. But we will, so while we'll give the user the summary, we do things like restrict the user from copying that information. So we do play, I hate to say fast and loose, because I don't think it's that way. We are trying to respect both sides, but that's us making a business decision around it, not necessarily a policy decision, if you will, and that aspect. But at the end of the day, I do think it comes back to usage. And I think RAG applies the same way. Usually in most of the examples I've heard here, people talking about RAG are talking about it in the case of going back out to the internet and doing additional internet searching in most cases. But there are also scenarios where that's happening internally. In other words, if I have a local collection of a series of documents, or I've got my SharePoint repository, for example, if that's all happening within my environment, I'm operating RAG, but is that the same use case? Is it the same scenario as going back out to the internet? And I would posit no. In fact, that's how we treat it in our use cases. So I thought I would put that back out there. At the end of the day, I think maybe we're using the wrong terms to talk about this, and I like Daria's idea that we talk about this perhaps in the usage case rather than saying inference and RAG.
Just to ask one more question for you. I think in yesterday's discussion, somebody said the user agent, the user, whatever you call it, Acrobat, right? If you call it the user agent, come
Sure.
on. But I think you're gonna override somebody else's preferences if your user asks you to. Is that something that you've thought about? That is there an overarching principle where you say hey, if the user preference and the owner's preference clash, is there some kind of handwritten thing you have, or is
We don't allow the user to override.
Okay.
So
Okay,
if the user attempts, so if the user has taken this asset offline, the asset has the AI preference that says don't use it inference time, the end user cannot override that. That is again, that's a decision or policy that we've made for our products. We prioritize the owner, the person who set the preference over the actual end user.
So,
and again, our decision.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to follow up based on Yadi's point, right?
Sure. Right, and I understand, we were talking yesterday, that may not be consistent with everybody's, but that's what we said.
4 more people. Fabrice.
That keep coming on robust text file, and I want to highlight that Microsoft AI today that is powering Bing, all of Copilot, ChatGPT, and Meta, and a lot of solutions on the internet is absolutely not looking at robust text file, except for allo disallow. We only leverage the meta tags and the HTTP header, no cache, no archive value, to see if we can use AI and no AI. This is my blog post. This is so we don't really have an implementation that is robots based. This is URL level based. Point number one. Point number two is what we selected to do is to satisfy publisher is really to have a blank rule. They said if you set it to no archive, then there is really no LLM training story. There is no RAG story. There is no inference story. That's completely idle. So what I believe is that, again, we don't need to go to each of every detail for now, maybe later on, but if we come up with some generic statement about no Gen AI, maybe the way search engines and AI solution will be using it is, okay, no LLM training, no retrieval of content for this kind of Uber scenario. And I believe, again, if we think no Gen AI, maybe this is equivalent of no archive, and this will be this Uber statement that kind of satisfy at the end publisher by not showing on the data, not retrieval the data. I think it's maybe sufficient for now to move forward.
Okay. Assessment.
So yeah, I think inference content generation is essential viewpoint here because I understand the AI training is their major focus of their AI preference, but I personally think inference is also essential because their Japanese law, copyright law is really different from the US or EU law. So their Japan's copyright law is basically allowing us to for any AI training. So if once we violate any other copyright on inference, we need to respect their copyright. But for the training, it is basically allowed. So in Japan's law, actually more than 10 years ago, in the search engine, the caching is not allowed at that moment, and the copyright law has been changed at that time. So the caching was allowed since then, and now the AI training is treated as same as their caching. So actually Japan is very free for their AI training from the different copyright law. Of course, there is other terms may be applied in the civil law, but basically their training is allowed. So so that is the reason why we need to care about the use of the generated content if we violate someone's copyright or not. So and the personal use may be allowed even if that may violate any other's copyright because the personal use is basically allowed. So I think we cannot ignore the difference in this topic.
So, having heard the conversation, I'm uncomfortable with limiting the topics that we really tackle, especially if it's something that a major stakeholder in this conversation is flagging as a priority. While it would produce a document or a vocabulary that would satisfy a set of use cases that are important, I think at this stage, cutting out a set of other use cases which are also flagged as important by voices.
Glenn, can I interrupt you? We're not talking about cutting anything out. I think we're just trying to, scope. So don't play the metagame. Talk about what's in the room.
Yeah. So I would lean towards being inclusive. So like the inference, the RAGs material, the whole shebang. I think we should attempt it because it is very relevant to a lot of important use cases for us today. And then deferring to later would be just kicking the can down the road. And we'll probably, and it has just to be bad that we'll come back. I'd much rather do it now, maybe get it not perfect, and deal with it as a refinement to the spec later on.
I think the challenge that we're hearing is the definitional one of how do we come up with a proposal with text that captures it and is somewhat robust. Although as I'm listening to this, I will say, I'm wondering, is it okay if we define something and then we have to discard it in a year or two because the world is moving so quickly? Is there concrete harm in that scenario? Maybe that's something we should examine.
That's not my point exactly. Getting it a little bit wrong, it isn't the worst sin. Omitting it completely from an important use case might be a big sin.
Yeah, thanks. David Robert? Sonia, I'll put you in a queue.
My name is Timid Robot. I'm wondering if we need to make any distinction when an interaction with AI happens, whether it's training at the beginning or it's post hoc training. I'm wondering if we could simplify the vocabulary by, instead of talking about kind of the developmental phases of an AI model, to just talk about interactions with an AI model, so that that we could treat post-model creation, summarization of content like we see in search products, the same way we treat chat prompt summarization of content, as an example.
Joe.
Hi, Joe. I think it's really important that we address RAG. I think it's going to lots of people to add one voice to this. That if we don't address the RAG issue, then I think will annoy a huge number of stakeholders and it will not be a very effective working group. I think it's very important to distinguish between RAG and like user-based prompting. I think is a useful way of saying it. I think it's very unhelpful for the internet community to say every time you want to use widely available AI tools to like easily translate something, that you have to check the content holder. That's probably too far. When you think about the sort of equity of the internet and the number of people who need to translate things and where they live as well, there are lots of issues there. To me, the useful distinction is whether or not things are agentic. So if I have somebody without human eyeballs who can't see adverts doing something, and that somebody is then a robot, then that really, really matters because this is what affects the ecosystems. But if I'm a human with eyeballs and I can be the advert when I copy the Financial Times article into my ChatGPT, then that's actually probably okay. There are also like rents to be had from people in this space. Like my office has an Elsevier subscription and we have to pay extra for the right to copy and paste Elsevier content into hot boxes. And this is quite an interesting like distribution of people's economic rents. And then we try not to think too hard about this working group as a solution to copyright problems, but we have to realize how it is going to be used downstream and policymakers pick it up. So yeah, we need to distinguish really carefully between agents and consumers and inference and RAG.
Yeah, I think it's not really about exclusion at this point. It's like, can we come up with a working definition that satisfies like the wide range of things that when people talk about inference or RAG, right? I think that's the bigger thing, like Mark was saying. So we cannot drag on forever, but I think if you can come up with a working definition, I think we can move ahead with that. Right?
Yeah. In that case, I think the agentic part of it is useful.
Right. And just to respond to one thing you said, I'm listening to the conversation. I'm keenly aware of it. You know, you look at the history of copyright; it is nothing but a continuing, war or balance between forces on, both sides of this, and it's playing out over time, and that's being mirrored now down in technical enforcement here, and so it's very interesting to see this happening. I do think that we need to be aware as a group of those forces in terms of rights holders and then uses and the various cultural and societal benefits of you being able to use content, and make sure that we're not falling too hard on one side or the other.
I'm learning a lot about different people's perspectives on what might come forward into RAG. I think from where I've been sitting, I've been focusing on it from a very specific point of view, mainly in the context of how models scrape content and summarize it as a substitute for users actually going to the content themselves, which is where I think the biggest pain point is for publishers, particularly smaller publishers that are already struggling to find an audience. I think that also based on what Leonard has been saying and the examples about using style preferences, I had thought of that as a particular example of RAG. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Maybe it is kind of just an umbrella term around inferencing that kind of encompasses RAG. And I'm also aware that RAG is a technique, and we have been talking about use cases. And so I think it sounds like we're moving towards thinking about what are the specific kinds of actions that we want to allow, enable third parties to signal as a preference that they do or don't want to allow. RAG may be the way that that's accomplished today, and in 6 months' time or a year's time, it may be something else. So there is some benefit in moving away from the technical definition of it to technique and thinking about what is the activity that we're trying to describe, and perhaps that's a more achievable approach.
Yeah, so I just had a small point to something that Mark said earlier. You were talking about the idea of possibly adding things early, or adding things and then possibly removing them in a later revision.
Removing, or they just quietly go away.
Yeah, so that's fine, or I would say and part of the reason I don't like the use of the word remove, and I would favor something like deprecation specifically, and I just wanted to point it out, although I think we're in agreement, is as we think about the idea that while it's one thing if this stuff goes into robots.txt or its equivalent, things that are easily modified, when we talking about attachments and the possibility that these get baked into assets that start floating around the internet forever and ever, those don't get changed. It can't be changed. So we never want to remove anything. Once it's there, and we should assume it's there forever, but deprecating something, treating it differently is perfectly reasonable. I just wanted to remind folks of that.
That is well recognized in the idea.
Yeah, no, but
Sonia, I put myself in queue for you. So.
Well, thank you. So RAG isn't as broad as inference, but it definitely is broad. There will be an impact on accessibility tools, on safety features, on spam filters, and the general adoption of AI. I think we start to broadly cover RAG. There might also be laws that prevent us from doing so. So the European Accessibility Act comes into force, I think, later this year, and that will also be relevant to RAG. So, for example, if I have an accessibility tool and it's allowing me in an agentic style to understand what is on a website because it's describing the images that are displayed, that could be a type of RAG. And there are other approaches that I think we would need to fully consider to see if there are better approaches than preventing input at RAG. So, for example, in the case of style, you could prevent the inferencing of the image that someone has concerns around using the style of, or you could prevent it at the output in a different way through output filters or through changing the way in which the AI is prompted. I think there are all these considerations to factor in before we start to, I think, move into defining TDM, inferencing, and RAG. Because I think actually there could be quite a negative impact to introducing things that stop these particular features and then removing them. And I think just also to just mention in relation to Japan, Japan issued guidelines on generative AI last year in January 2024, covering RAG and confirming that RAG is something that is permissible under Japanese law, provided that you're not outputting the expression, essentially. There are also provisions under Japanese law controlling search and what you can output for search. Just wanted to mention that as well.
Yeah, thanks. I think like this got covered a little bit yesterday. I think like Paul talked about it, Alyssa talked about it, was that like, the owners of the content express the preferences, but there could be a legal framework that's outside that could override it, right? Like I think like Paul was talking about the research exemption for this thing, right? Like, so whatever you do, like and the TDM exception means that if you're like doing this for scientific research, like that's getting overridden. So I would think like your thing falls into that kind of exception where like, like ADA, for example, in the US could override like the other things. That's kind of how I see it. Like at least there's like probably something outside our stuff that could handle it.
Yeah, and I think we should kind of discuss those and have time to discuss those so that we don't suddenly include something in a spec that requires people that want to comply with the spec to have to then figure out how best to adapt the implementation so that they're facilitating those other very important aspects of RAG.
Yes. Thank you. Sarah?
Sarah Jennings. One thing that I wanted to flag is the element to which if RAG isn't there or inference isn't there, the fallback is just like a complete exclusion under TDM as it's currently defined. And I think to the extent that this work is largely trying to rebalance and slightly open up what is a kind of increasing tendency towards closing down content, I think including it, but maybe having a slightly imperfect definition at this point that can then be refined, is probably more advantageous, because there is still a fallback here that people can just say TDM no, that will cover this, and in the absence of it, that will just be what happens. So I think, from my perspective, including RAG at this point is, like, I don't see a necessary harm, because I still think there is a fallback if the definition is incomplete.
TDM is very broad and will cover inferencing. I think that will be problematic as well. But I mean, in terms of having to comply with a very broad TDM exception that covers inferencing, I don't think there's a requirement to do that, even on the European law, because of the temporary covers exception.
Thank you. Mark, you're next.
Yeah, so I'm hearing, certainly lots of interest in trying to address the case. It sounds like, we're going to spend time on this. But I'm also hearing, there's kind of the approach that if I can use people as proxies for ideas, apologies. Ted's talked about, the kind of the actions, the use case where we try to identify how it is used and then carve those off. And that is potentially a very open set, and as we've talked, it's very much a moving target. And the other thing I heard, which I don't has gotten as much attention yet in the discussion, and I'm misinterpreting, please correct me, but Timid Robot, your kind of notion of the time of use, of whether it's the training, the initial input before, or if it's at the, what we call inference time, or how we're going to do that, without as much reference to the purpose. And that seems to me, although it's a coarser tool, I think we can define those with a little more surety. And so I'm just interested to hear people's reactions of if we're going to choose one of those two general approaches, and we don't have to choose one or two necessarily, but what are the trade-offs between those two approaches, and what are the responses to that?
To be clear, I was arguing that we ignore the time and only care about the interaction. So we would consider training before and training after just to be training.
Right. Okay. All right. So I did misunderstand.
Yeah. So I want to go back to what Joe, I think, was mentioning, is balancing the, I guess the needs of the publishers in this case, and then the end users, and not sort of causing undue harm for either. And that's of course a useful thing. I think you suggested that whenever the behavior is sort of agentic, then these rules apply. I'm not sure that's actually right. Like from a user perspective, I want to benefit from the benefits of AI. I want to use automation. I want to use bulk operations instead of having to read everything myself. And if I can't do that, I have to rely on somebody else's prepared thing. That's a loss. But there might be some other ways of attacking this. Like I think the harm for publishers comes mostly when you sort of, for instance, recreate the style or the content. But there are many other aspects of using AI that doesn't really cause that kind of harm. You ask questions, and even if you recreate content, but do it in for the sake of translating to your own language, I don't know if that's something that needs to be prohibited.
Can I very quickly and say, I don't think that excludes users from using these tools, but if I want to go to a normally paywalled, news website with my agent and summarize it for me, it's totally allowed. I think it's reasonable for that website to require me to have a paid subscription first. If I have an FT subscription, I should be able to link my robot to it, and I'm sure the FT is probably going to be okay with that because I'm already paying. But deploying like innumerable agents to kind of circumvent paywalls, read FT articles for me, and then summarize the response does seem to be a bad faith use of the FT's content.
People are circumventing paywalls.
I think that's very much the concern of rights holders. The way they are, it's a use that you might have to be aware of. Well, they should be precisely, and then the question of alternative use enforceable, and I think this is also a live question. But I just want to point out that I agree that users want to be able to use these tools, but it's about using them in a good way for publishers. And I don't think users are necessarily aware that when they use like AI summaries and agents, that they are depriving the sources that they respect of revenue that supports them.
Yeah, I mean, of course, you need to use things in good faith, but I don't think that should necessarily translate to agentic behavior being forbidden and other behavior.
But forbidding illicit behavior in a like AI.text is different. So yesterday with Leonard's point, it's not a complete no, it's a no, come talk to me. And there might be an API that says, oh, if you could use an access token, of course you can agentically scrape the website, but you have to go through this channel first.
But isn't it just a question of using the access token, not about the tool that you're using to access the token?
But I think this whole like discussion is based on like publicly available domain content, whatever that means.
Right.
So what happens, via private channels, I think is probably out of scope of this.
Yes.
I think that is an assumption. So anything goes if you've got a private contract. But in terms of public interactions, you have to obey preferences to be aggressive.
But why do you need to put this in some kind of AI.text? The AI system can figure out there's a paywall and then ask the user, credential.
I think the concern is that there are bad faith AI actors that are like escaping that process.
But they might not adhere to your preferences.
True.
By the way, I did challenge your fundamental assertion that this is for public content. Given the lack of another better way of doing it, even those private interactions will probably try to make use of this stuff to express your preferences for private interactions. There may be some that don't, but if I'm using it for public content, but then I say, oh, here's my token, let's move up to a private relationship, great. But I'm probably still going to use this grammar as a way to express what I'm giving you the capabilities. It may be a different expression of preferences that I provided because we now have a different relationship. But I don't think the use case is excluded from my conversation.
I think that on the assumption you've got a private relationship, then there'll be a contract that's written normally. In my head, I'm very much thinking about this as whatever we write is a standard to which laws will refer that will determine whether or not interactions are legal. And I appreciate that's a very small subset of what this group is maybe working on.
Right.
But I think that's what I'm personally more interested in.
I get it, and
Glenn, just a sec. Gary, are you done?
Not entirely, because I just wanted to reply that not the whole internet is behind a paywall. So there's lots of content. My intention with the automation was access that I have access to anyway, and that would be, in my case, mostly openly available content that I can actually use automation to look at that. And I fear that with our standards, it might say in the future that, you can look at this personally with your eyes, but automation, no.
This is a normative question to the group. Like, do you want to give rights holders publicly available content permission to control, for good faith actors, how their content is used? And the assumption is yes, otherwise.
That's kind of why we're here.
But that's the rights holder to decide how they want you to access their content.
The majority
Perfectly their right.
of publicly available content is also sustained through advertising. So for every time you decide to use an AI tool to summarize the content on a website and not visit it, that is one less view that they're able to use to earn advertising with.
Sure.
So the idea of publicly available, I think, is massively broad. There is a ton of publicly available content which is still commercially monetizable and has to be sustained in some way.
Of course, but you still need to balance sort of the rights of the possibilities of the end users to do things with other stakeholders.
Sure. And you balance finding that balance.
And I just want to reemphasize that ultimately, we will not decide that balance. That balance will be decided in legal fora around the world. We're here to express preferences, and they will be interpreted in different ways and overridden and ignored and so.
Yeah, I think the best you can do is like come up with this in a sufficient granularity that these users are distinguished. I think that's kind of what the best we can do. Yeah. Glenn?
The reason I was sensitive is I want to say I think we're getting down into a tangent here of we're not setting either nation policy, regional policy, or copyright policy. What we're setting is a set of preferences for a person who's publishing content or whoever has the capability. Not arguing about who, but somebody's setting the preferences for some content. Here's how, and there's going to be a grammar saying, here's what they are. That is not going to match up with either current or ideally future policies. That will be for somebody else to worry about. What we can know by looking back in the history and how copyright elements has evolved on the internet is expressions of this and preferences get debated in policy and legal forms, and they evolve. If I look back over the last 10 years, we've had some significant changes, right? The original models for taking music from one format and translating to an MP3 were debated. And we have some technical people who went very fast in one direction, but eventually we came to a balance in the ecosystem where businesses have thrived, billions have been made by some rights holders, but also people now have easy access to a lot of content. That landscape evolved. It didn't evolve because the preferences settings were set perfectly. It evolved because after some preferences were available, the conversation legally and framework-wise took place and some decisions were made. Likewise, when we start talking about things like DVRs, the ability to record content that was broadcast and play back later. Originally, roughly the landscape, the lawyers had that discussion, resolved that discussion eventually, right? We're not going to solve that. We're giving some people some basic premises, ways to express that today. I think that's a really good thing. I think that opening up and being liberal in what we allow people to do is a good start. And that other conversation will take place and will evolve. And we'll probably come back and say, we'd like to request some changes here because we'd like to be able to express that in a better way. So I think in the end, getting behind whether it's a paywall or not, what technique the AI is using for doing the analytics isn't really helpful. I think maybe the lesson to step back and say, let's talk about uses, because the person specifying the use, here's my content, I want to tell you what you can use it for, that's something they can understand. The people consuming the AI preferences, looking at that list of, well, I want to take that, I want to use it for something. Let me hear what your preferences are for use. That's something they can understand too, without getting into the weeds of the technical term or the current AI technology approach. That technology will evolve. The use will stay ongoing. So I just propose we focus on the uses in the language and the grammar and the conversation. We don't worry about paywalls or not paywalls, and we don't worry about how it meshes necessary with current policy or policy that we perceive may evolve or not evolve in response to it. Just the purposes of it.
Thanks, Glenn. Ted, the next.
I have 3 quick comments. The first of them is actually to Sarah and Bradley. For some reason, there is a fan that makes it very hard to hear both of you. Please be as loud as Glenn.
I'm not sure how to take that.
I can hear you fine. I don't have to stand up and look at you, so that would be great. The second is, I agree with what Glenn was saying, to focus on action. As I said yesterday, we're making an acquisition time signal in most cases, whether it's coming as part of a container or getting part of robots that keep speed. But we're mostly talking about what uses are being made of the data. How it's being treated in the inside is largely opaque to us, and it's going to change very rapidly, and so I think that's right. And the last thing is, we're way in the wrong part of this discussion for having had all this discussion yesterday. We haven't lost ground, but we haven't made a lot this morning. And I think it would be very useful for us to kind of do a little toward the problem maybe of saying, everybody give us a yes if or a no unless clause, and you want this vocabulary to be able to handle. And we've been talking a lot about no unless you pay me. That's a very simple one. Yes, if you are using this for accessibility or comprehensibility, so translation or image recognition or things that are those are yes ifs, those are no unlesses that help us make ground on how expressive the vocabulary has to be for a minimal viable product by August. Because if we're at this level today, we're not going to get to August unless we spend a week in some other closed room with large fans, and maybe that's not the best.
Really good point, Ted. But I think like some of the at least like Gary and I think Fars was typing in the chat too, right? Like even having that ability might push things a little bit towards a content holder was a concern that's kind of getting raised, right? That somebody could be able to do things even if somebody expresses something, it's something that the legal framework permits, right? So if blah blah blah, it's probably outside the vocabulary itself. Even if you do express that preference, things could get done otherwise, right?
We all agree that we're talking about preferences, that the context may give you other rights. In the EU, this is the basis of Paul's discussion of the research. We're not overriding other things. We're giving people the ability to express a preference, and that's core. I do agree that there is a tension here But I think one of the things that we need to understand is at what level do we need to be able to express these preferences so they are not overly restricted when that's not the intent of the preference holder, right? And I think that this is the point Sonia made. Please let's not default to TPM for everything, because it's way too big. If we need to be able to say, this is permitted for transformations for comprehensibility, I don't care, to take Timothy's perspective, whether you do it and store the translation and give it to me, or do it at the moment I ask you, please give this to me in Kazakh. That's not the important part. The important part was that the transformation was for comprehensibility, and that's a use case. So we need to understand how to make a minimal viable product where it's granular enough not to be ruling out either the useful agentic things that you're talking about, the public good things that Lars is talking about. Because if we don't, we're going to end up with very high level categories that are so coarse they're going to hurt us. And that's why I was suggesting before the tabla of give me a yes, if, or a no, unless, that you think we need to be able to express. Because I think that's going to help us establish the level of granularity that the folks around this table or on this meetup think is needed.
So I'll react to that. I agree that establishing the level of granularity is important. That's exactly what we should be doing now. But I don't know that gathering every specific, thing is going to help, because that's going to go to fine grain very quickly, and there's not going to be a lot of agreement. And I come back to that experience of these incredibly fine-grained vocabularies like P3P, I'm still sorry, that get us nowhere. And especially if it's a bad reproduction of copyright law and all of the fine balances in history and jurisdictional problems there, I fear that our output will not be very useful in the real world.
So I will remind you that P3P was in part a reaction to an even stupider idea that I first joined the IETF, which was kid code, which was encoding in URLs the age appropriateness of the information behind the URL,
well,
which had absolutely no granularity at all.
You are tempting me to digress into the history of privacy standards, which I will resist.
The point is, if we don't start tackling where that granularity is as a conversation,
right,
and we can both be informed by our history here, we're going to end up with something so coarse by August that it will not be a viable product for our community.
So it seems like and this goes back maybe unintentionally to what I said before, is that the very coarse grained is, training time, inference time, sorted out, or even indeed what's in Paul's draft. And then very fine grained is every possible use of AI, which is an unbounded set right now, because it turns out that AI is computers these days, for better or worse. We need to find a level somewhere in the middle.
Thank you. Thanks, Jeff. Paul?
So, let me take it from here. I largely agree with what Mark said about this is what Ted is proposing has the risk of going too granular, too fast, and bog us down. One part of what you said is you referenced the useful use cases that we don't want to block. There is no universal agreement what is the useful use of AI or not. You talk to publishers, you talk to sort of movie industry rights holders, talk to different people, they will tell you they will have very different ideas about what useful is. So there's a very subjective assessment in most cases. Yes, there is these things which sort of underpins all the marketing language and will help us cure cancer. Maybe everybody can agree on that, but sort of like you dig down into what's a useful use of content or not, and you will end up in huge disagreements. So I think the correct level, like the risk that if we're going with level of granularity and the extent of the vocabulary that's now in the draft, right, like the biggest risk is that the only way of using this thing to sort of, if you have concerns about future inference time, as Sarah said, like people will avail themselves of the biggest possible category that's the category. That happens to be the one that's backed up by the law, at least in Europe. It's backed up. The UK government wants to go into that direction, or at least indicated that at some point in the past that it wanted to go into that direction. There are also other exceptions to that. I'll come to that, but like, so we'll need, like, if we have vocabulary that says we allow you to express what you think your content should be, how your content should be used in the context of training, but when having a vocabulary that doesn't allow you to express how you think how your content should be used by AI systems that have already been trained, there is a gaping hole in that vocabulary. On a granularity level, adding this is still sort of like the same level of granularity as the general approach that we have there, very broadly defined types of users sort of that we are. I think some of the flexibility comes in, these are preference signals. In some cases, they are backed by the law. In some cases, like companies may decide to follow on these preference signals because they think it's a good thing or because it sort of like helps them navigate sort of business relationships, etc. In the end, the decision what to do is at the level of the users that they follow these, how they. I think that will, and maybe Adobe is a little bit also historically on the strict side of trying to lock everything down and make it possible to extract something from that PDF, versus there will also be other implementations of these standards who probably maybe stick to communicating a general preference and allowing you to just do whatever you want with the PDFs that you have on your own. I think that we need to, that breathing space comes from the fact that these are not hard rules, they are preference signals that in some contexts may be backed by the power of the law, in some contexts they may be sort of becoming important elements of contractual relationships, in some cases maybe they are entirely voluntary. That is also like, if you go back to robots to some degree, like this is also like something that is generally followed as best practice because it allows the ecosystem to thrive. And I think that's where we want to go. But going into two different, like two detailed descriptions of particular use cases will make this impossible to agree on, will make this take ages, and will also make this age very badly because like the environment is sort of moving so fast. But like if we leave these gaping holes, like not saying anything, then we're directing people to these problematic categories that are there because they have to be there, but that I think most people in this room really would prefer if they weren't used because there is better, more precise ways to articulate.
I agree.
Sorry, Sonia, we have a queue.
We
have a
disagree
queue.
about this.
And that point's been made. So we've closed the queue because I think we need to go to a break soon. If folks could keep their comments brief, and I would love it if you would focus on the level of granularity, just what the coarse grain versus fine grain, and any specific proposals for what you think the vocabulary term should look like. That I think would help us move forward.
Yeah, and I think like Alyssa's point about like Tom's draft, like having some stuff that we can kind of look at and kind of beat around, like it's a really good idea. I think probably we should like do it, like and see if there's something we can pick from there or not, right? Like, and I think to Mark's point, I think the important point is like we don't want like too big of a cudgel to beat up people with. So if everything falls, like I think Gary and Ted made the point, right? Like if it's too broad to block stuff, like it will get blocked. So I think the idea would be like kind of have like a better, like I think like Ted, did you call it like unless, if unless or something?
Yes, if or no unless.
Yeah, so I think like that could be like a good idea to figure out like if there's like smaller things that we know is needed. So, Colin?
Yeah, I see your point about the need to enumerate all of these use cases. I think that that does conflict a little bit with, it definitely conflicts with our goals. I mean, this timeline and sort of just with the broader conception of needing an MVP. Also, just the Paul's point about what is useful or the utility of this is clearly not converged upon. But I think this is a group of engineers, right? Where as these things are enumerated, we go, okay, there's RAG, there's inference. Most people do not have this level of literacy too. I mean, we see a huge, I think there was some research that came out from 2023 that said something like 28% of robot-style text files were conflicting with their terms of service even, and that was just the changes that were made in 2023 too, due to the scraping of the web, the increase of the scraping of the web. So I think we really need to consider literacy when we give the users the affordances for all of these switches, like a massive engineer enumeration of all of the specifics. It makes sense only insofar as people are capable of making those decisions. But you know, and that also can happen in future charters and whatnot. So I think the broad categorization of kind of what you're suggesting at a higher level makes sense to me. But I do think the comment that your misunderstanding of Timid's reading of the timing of the application, I think, to me, makes a lot of sense. I think that point of intervention decouples the sort of data aggregation stage from the application stage, which is when I think you can determine how it's being used, right? So if you know data common crawl is collected, I'm using something from common crawl, I then can know what that, like, how to interpret that preference at that point in time, whereas at the collection stage, it's completely independent. Yeah, I think the broad categories that were suggested yesterday roughly make sense to me. I do support having, I don't know how we want to call it, but a separate bucket that is independent from AI training and the nested generative AI for the separate bucket for, I guess, broadly inference. We can, the nomenclature of that to be determined, but yeah, I think I can broadly support that, but would consider how we sort of think about those different categories as being related to maybe pre-training and post-training applications, or pre-training and inference applications.
Thank you. Pierce?
Yeah, I think I'm not sure if Mark was thinking when I mentioned the sort of time basis around the data usage. Just trying to think about it. I think it could be useful in that maybe one could say that this data can only be used for sort of inference within this time window. Then in that sense, it could potentially sort of allow one to constrain the type of usages, because as I said, the actual the value of the information falls off with time, like with a lot of sort of media, whatever, like films or something like that. That when they're released, they're obviously much more valuable than they are a few months later. But then I guess it could be sort of gamed as well, in that potentially if there was some sort of time window only aspect, then one could you could potentially sort of time your training runs so that they came within the window of the real time access allowed. So I think one would still need to have some kind of training versus inference distinction there. But I think that the time aspect could be a useful constraint, as I think discussions going about other aspects of constraints around what type of use, whether it's just translation or whatever. It can go down a bit of a rat hole, that kind of thing. So, but time is simpler, if you like. So, and to maybe specify. But that's really my point.
Okay, thank you, Pierce. Mark himself off the queue, so Miriam.
So I think the question, if you want to add a category, is like, first of all, is it actionable by the content consumer, but also is it understandable by the content holder? And I think in this case, both is a yes. So on the side of the AI system operator, I mean, there is a clear difference between training and interference. And it doesn't matter like what exactly you do in the interference, but it's two phases that can be distinguished clearly. And on the content holder side or content creator or whatever, I think there's also cases for it. I think there are cases where you want to say, generally you can use my data for AI training, but I don't want you to use the most recent data because this is kind of more valuable. This is kind of what my business is about, that I provide like that I provide news or whatever. So I don't want you to use it immediately because that takes my value away. And I think there's also another case where you want to say, I don't want you to use my whole data for training because that creates value for your model, and I don't want to like give you this for free, but I still want you to be able to reference me like more recent things. I want to be part of it as well. So I think there are cases for both, and so that's why I think we need these categories.
Okay, Mark.
And about the timing, I think there is a time component here, but I'm not sure it makes sense to specify that because whatever you put there is really random, right? So at the end, I think it really depends on a little bit on like how you have your training intervals or whatever. So you have to make on the content, the consumer side, you have to make a reasonable decision. But defining something will be arbitrary.
And it strikes me that listening to you, Maria, there is another qualitative difference in that training time. The use of my data becomes almost, purportedly homeopathic. It is so diluted that it is, again, purportedly not available on the other side. Although we know that is sometimes a fiction, and there are interesting court cases about this right now. Whereas at the inference time, that data is specifically being used for a purpose, but there's something transformative happening. And I think it's the transformative aspect that is making people nervous in many cases. It's not like search, where search, my data is being presented and a link is being presented, and if there's a headline, the headline's there, and we're comfortable with the balance there. But if there's a summary happening or some sort of agentic thing happening, then there's a loss of control. And it's about that data specifically. It doesn't have that homeopathic effect. And so I think that's one of the dividing lines that might be interesting to have this distinction.
Thank you. Glenn, last word, quick.
Yeah, I'll try to be quick. So I think we keep straying back into especially rights and can I enable things to happen or not enable things. I think we should just put that out of scope, because nothing we're going to set here will set or add or remove rights practices. This is the preferences thing. We have to keep our users in mind, okay? The users are not going to understand the underlying AI techniques. They're not going to understand the different phases of processing. They're not. They're going to understand some very high-level basic relationships and uses of their creative ideas and their creative works. And it's allowing them a facility to express that will produce a good grammar that people will find useful. And it will avoid the pitfalls of some of the privacy stuff, which got really in the weeds. And it got too detailed. Keep it high level simple. I think Ted's on a path, although I think Ted's still maybe too deep into the weeds. But I like Ted's approach, but I think we need to pull it up and make it more high level and more abstract. And hopefully that's short.
Lovely. Okay, let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break. Come back at 5 to the hour, and maybe try and spend the time before lunch seeing if we can get this to a place where we have a potential path forward. And then I think after lunch we'll switch to attachments.
Sounds good.
Sound good? Okay. So 10 minutes.
We
check?
We are tweeting out.
Here is For many years, and for some reason, everybody uses Spider-Man as their reference. Like, well, I'm gonna control Spider-Man. And it's weird, it's not.
Really? It didn't work?
Spider-Man.
It's you.
Look at these RFCs and tell me what they do.
From an IETF perspective, I think they're somewhat out of our wheelhouse, both expertise wise. If you take the fast, we have some people in the group that do have expertise in space, you have expertise, I have some expertise.
Yeah.
But I think from an IETF perspective, outside of our engineering expertise.
Almost feel like, well, the PTN is not just like the, let's block the scary thing. Then let's block.
So I'm for enablement, so I have an IETF trustee, but also literally like the purpose of the IETF trust
all the features
to house the technical standards each runs on and make them available to the IETF so they can continue making technical standards. So, and then people can take an influence. So I'm an evil big corporate studio, but I'm also an internet guy, so I walk both sides.
Yeah, that's a big deal.
But we deal with some of the stuff outside. So let me give you a very practical example. In the IETF context, so we have all these
wholesale
decades of technical
dropping out into the future.
We literally, in our licensing terms for those, we do have licensing terms. We assert class rate over them and we protect them. But we have licensing terms that say things like, oh, you're doing IETF. Yeah, you're an implementer. You want to translate to another language. You're good to go. Although we do put restrictions on saying when you reproduce a technical RFC, you got to reproduce the whole thing. You can't reproduce a part of it because you behind that find people other things like say, well, I'm going to take this, this, and this. I'm going to write my own prose around it, and then it's going to look like it's the IETF specification. No. You're taking part of my words, you're quoting me, but you're not acknowledging. So we say, look, you can translate it. Go for it. You can even publish it. It's great. You can take it and put it in a book, and some people engage and say, I want something book for money with IETF RFCs in it. And that's okay. But it's for money. Yeah, we're not against people making money if they want to print it and give it to you. In fact, there's a website that says, we'll search IETF RFCs for a fee and tell you where we find things in it. Yeah, that's fine. They want to put up, if you're dumb enough to pay them, go ahead. And I'm wondering if that may give us a pathway here, and that we, instead of being worried about people being overly controlling, like limiting or overly raw, simply give a framework to say, well, what do you want to do? And then ultimately, ecosystem takes that expression and plays out. And to draw the example of the cloud PBR for my cable business, one of the big debates we talked about in the days of PBR was the early interpretation by the law said, look,
surveillance
in the US, US said it's fine for you to take a recording of a broadcast. This was the VCR.
And
if you have a VCR, you record a broadcast, you're in use for it. Okay, decision made in that context. Later on, when we got into
I think there's urgency beyond
digital
protecting corporate relevance.
I agree.
There was an early interest by said, look, man, instead of you put a copy on your own digital recording on your own eBay, what if I just made a copy in my cloud, and then when you want to watch it, I'll give it to you. And the early people said, well, read the rules and well, there's these services, and I've got the copyright rules. And the copyright says I can't make a copy unless authorized by the right holder. And I'm not going to get hidden. I'm not going to go for each TV show back and asking that. I can't. You can't make a digital copy in the cloud for the thing. But when that use case came up as a business, the industry had that conversation. You know, refine the interpretation of the law as it applies to that use case. And now cloud DVRs are a thing. But none of that was a
They keep changing their mind every week.
Yeah. For any of the expressions, or any of the ways we did all this stuff, it was entirely a policy people evolving their interpretation of what the rules that they had already set up. Whereas it hasn't been, we're just nerds, right? It's a digital copy, digital copy or digital copy, you don't care if it's in your own world, it's in the cloud, it doesn't say. And I wonder if that's taking a tax here, like, I appreciate your concerns, but from a nerd engineering standpoint, expressing that they just give a basis to then start having policy meetings and have a conversation and evolve what they decide to shoot for and be.
Yeah, I guess.
Because they're already most people, by the way, they post things.
No, I guess, they'll.
I mean, I get that.
It needs to be something that's usable. It can't be just OE that had to hit the August date. I mean, it's a trade-off. We can't just do the minimum.
So, yes, but also like usable for the stakeholder, for all the stakeholders.
Also, of course.
Like, the open source AI developer that wants to do this in the right way.
Sure.
And the rights holders, and also like they have to listen to their
Well, I'm trying to the other, I'm trying to not even deal with it, like, not even get into like saying we allow them to use those types of data. I would ultimately like to see your where your service from.
This is from Muslim State.
More fundamentally, we have some basics. Say what I think we have the classics of you can copy it. You can redistribute it, not just differently copy it.
Not for the sake of the meeting.
We have a new thing, which is staring a lot of copy people, which is you can learn to mimic it for its style. That's a new thing that exists in copyright law, does not cover. And I don't know what the answer will be, but I'm starting to wonder if like the cases we need to focus on are not so granular at the PDM level or even the training level. But it really is focusing on like, well, can you read it? Can you look at it? Can you, through some AI means, look at this piece of content? Okay, yes, you can look at it. I'm going to put people look at it. Okay, will I allow you to, in a classic sense, take this content and using whatever you're doing with AI, redistribute it? Okay, and then we can argue, well, yes, but there's a lot of sub-context there, such as the accessibility treatment that's put in there, right? Maybe we get a little granular into that set of, what you can redistribute under, and there's always the classics. You can commercially redistribute, or you can not commercially redistribute. And then maybe we have this other category, which is like the stylistic aspects, right? You can look at my content, but you can't. I want to express a preference. Please don't extract my style. Or I may say, look, yeah, I think that's really cool. If you want it, feel free.
I mean, that, like you say, isn't covered by copyright law, but there are other, we're still, for example, Microsoft is like changing the way that if you're a rights holder and report concerns, I don't want my name used in a blog, for example, and that really helps with kind of addressing issues around style. It doesn't
resolve fundamental core issue, but that will not. That will be an IETF thing. That's going to play outside. Because like I'm from California, for instance, and we have a set of rules that say, if you are walking in the shopping mall and there's a sign that says filming may take place here, then if I capture your image and I later reuse it for any purpose, you're good to go because I told you. But that's a California thing, right? Because we do a lot of productions and they create that law. We also, in the US, we have this idea of like you're a famous person whose thing, what you do is a brand thing, right? That you have to be like, how do you see the user, or how do you look, or if you go to the Kardashians, I'm not sure what value they provide, but I think it's how they look. It certainly isn't anything they say or do because they don't seem to do anything. And I used to have a thing in my terms of employment where I wasn't allowed to actually help. But, and they were part of the town, so I couldn't say anything publicly against the Kardashians, but that's no longer the truth. They're no longer part of my studio, and I no longer have that terms in my contract. So I can bash the Kardashians in public. And say, they produced nothing tonight. But they're a style thing. Like, we do rules say like, like I couldn't take Robert De Niro and have Robert De Niro sell donuts. So I could, but he'd have to be Robert De Niro. I can't take somebody that looks like Robert De Niro and just have him silently walk into a donut shop, advertisement, and buy donuts. Even if he never says I'm Robert De Niro, I'm not Robert De Niro. But if he looks like Robert De Niro and just implies that he is Robert De Niro, I can't do that.
Yeah.
But that's a policy legal thing, not a.
No, exactly, I totally agree. I think, if we're thinking about how to use it, I think we need to identify, perspectives of the legal framework, because I think people can have different perspectives.
Yeah.
And, we don't.
No, I'm gonna ask my
training
is
Oh,
Max
Yeah. So we didn't change what we wrote. Just, but I think at the same time, you're going to be able to create an ecosystem that works for everyone. And an internet works for everyone. And so if there are particular concerns like copying AI training, rights holders, they should be able to express it. Yeah, and what are the other things? And I think there is a danger, if we say just teaching that we start to create laws that actually change the way the internet works.
The internet will always be evolving and changing.
Oh, but in a very like.
Not always good ways, sometimes bad ways, sometimes bad ways.
Agree.
It's been my experience that the people with money will come in and say, I see an opportunity to make money and my use change the direction of things this way. And they'll place some arbitrage in people's rights or the harms. Well, my internet person. We videotape all the activity. This one isn't being fully recorded. We're tiny little dots, but we're reading the board. And even right now, Mark's got his thing active, so this is, we're reading the board right now. Yeah, we publish all of our stuff on YouTube.
Yeah.
It's not beyond belief that somebody could, in the future, train an AI, a generative AI, to represent all of the people in the IETF. Audio, visually, stylistic wise.
I hope for every
5 years from now, 10 years from now.
Sonia?
Arguing, and
Do you have a problem?
Sorry.
Oh, yeah, I don't have a.
Let her get caught, because I made her
Yeah,
talk,
I'm gonna get-
and she's getting caught, so don't. Let
Let
her get caught. Don't block her, don't block her. She's coming.
Oh, yeah, sorry, that went to you, did it? Sorry. I don't have a copy. I don't think. Did I? Oh, maybe I did. Oh, thank you. All right, excellent. All right. Okay, I'll do that.
I can manage one person. That's not only because Martin needs to do that because he uses this machine for the other stuff.
Oh, I see.
So I'm
Okay.
for you.
Yeah, so I said, I've got both my emails in. And neither came up to reset my password, and neither came up to inbox, so
Okay, probably
I'm
this
assuming I
is-
don't have the account. Yeah, sorry about that. I'll do that now. Thank you.
So I must do,
Okay. This, over the recent few months, yeah. Before that, I wasn't doing I'm basically,
oh wow, that's a big sense.
I think global, but I mean, basically it's really just the UK, US, and EU.
IDYP, so IDYP, so we do IP there.
You got a different jacket.
No, so it's outside.
Same jacket.
So it's IP, so when I'm doing IETF stuff, it's in a protocol.
Yeah.
And when you know stuff, it's intellectual property, so I do IP. I just like.
I get that.
For the whole situation. What, so it's myself. And then
Yeah.
I can come to the workshop since I was on being involved in the content or an agency. So I said practicing. Those maybe not, it's the long set of works. It's especially really bad. You also have the right.
What about Daniel's team?
Okay. So perhaps in the spirit of what Ted suggested, maybe we could go around the room and just get, like, what would, the one thing you would want us to see us shift here? And again, keeping in mind the discussions of that granularity, but I'm just interested to hear what the preferences are. Let's take it 2 minutes.
Sounds good.
Yeah. So
did you see Ted's last message?
No.
I think, okay. So it's like based on a conversation we had about coffee. It's like unless if for X or unless like not for X kind of thing. So what kind of granularity can we specify X as was kind of where like we saw the disagreement between people already in a smaller group. So maybe that's, if you want to dig into it, we can do that.
Sure.
Or we can park it for some other time, right? But because we don't want to take all the time.
Sorry, I don't normally put coffee things in there, but because we have a bunch of remote people who wouldn't have been able to stand around this in the coffee, I wanted to capture it to some degree.
Put a pin in that for now, I think.
Yep.
Yeah. So let's look around the room. Eric, you want to start?
So Eric Cisco, I'm with me an observer here with my IETF glasses. I think it's not so much about getting a fine granular stuff because it's becoming too complex for the end user and you are losing time. Again, I'm an observer, right? What I would love to get out of this group is basically a kind of a grammar or a data model and maybe a grammar associated to it to express whatever the end user and the policies wants to do. And then it's up to the IETF unit to attach those grammar and serialize it to ATP, IMAP, or whatever you want. So basically very simple.
Okay. And please, let's keep them brief because we do have a lot.
Yeah, I mean, if the question is overall, then I think, we've expressed it. I think we need that abstract data model, as we talked about, is key. I think it is really about defining that data model and that set of options that are available, and that it can then be applied everywhere else. I think the one thing that we should probably avoid is any sort of user agent specific instructions, because I think that's where we tend to get our problems.
And specifically about the inference ragtime question.
On the inference ragtime question, I think we should do something. I think that, as we've seen, rat holing can be problematic as to exactly what that is, but I think we need to do something.
So maybe something course grained, it sounds like.
I think course grain would be fun.
And there was Leonard for the remote people.
Leonard,
Please state your
sorry.
name before.
Timid robot, I'd like to see vocabulary where new, so if you imagine the vocabulary has a thing and equals, and then like an action, like Gen AI equals no, as an example. I'd like the vocabulary to be robust enough that users can supply their own options for both sides of that equation.
So, I think post-grain, whichever definitions before the deliverable, because it's AI is still emerging, so there. In my suggestion, I think it would be better to have a different research group to work on this kind of intensive discussion, so that we define some kind of their up-to-date vocabulary or something like that. But for the working group, I think we need to work on their current program to be solved. So we can start with their post-grain one and for the information graph, and for the for the signaling or some kind of the protocols. Of course, we need to define the fine grain, but for the whatever I think we can start with the close grain.
Gary?
Yeah, I think we can achieve a coarse-grained vocabulary and with extensibility. I mean, that should be in day one. I think when it comes to the inference piece, I'm thinking that would be maybe achievable if we were able to add some kind of qualification to it, or inference for content recreation or some such.
I think ultimately we're trying to build building blocks, and from my perspective, the building blocks that we need are a set of extensible. The building blocks that we need require us to not necessarily a set of extensible actions, but a set of extensible. Gosh, I'm not expressing this. I was expressing this so much better over coffee. So why don't I just fall silent in my part?
So I think that we should try our best, and I'm here to support the group as well, and to come up with limited but inclusive vocabulary by August that addresses the issues of concerns that the stakeholders have, and I think that the stakeholders that we have in the room, they're quite they have different interests and opinions and perspectives, and I think that, but I don't think that will end up stopping us from coming up with limited vocabulary by August. If we keep it limited and not want to address every single thing that is going to happen in the future.
Colin?
Yep, I think the coarse-grained approach is a good start, with extensibility technically being within scope, but not within the time frame. So maybe just beyond. So yeah, coarse-grained probably can solve the most imminent problems with greater definition to expand upon.
Maybe?
So I feel that that the content owners like express needs for very fine-grained vocabulary, but I think that's also based on assumptions, different understandings, and not always that clear like what the implication is. So I think we really also need to look at what are the actions that can follow definitely depends on, is there something that you can distinguish when you use it later? And that is much more growth range to actually be actionable. So I think we like only if a different action can follow, it makes sense to have a different category. But of course, we also need to make sure that the content owner understands what this preference and what the implications are.
Joe? I think that this challenge of matching the developers' understanding of what's happening with their data and what the future uses will be, which is often quite coarse and uncertain, versus the data providers who are normally rights holders who have got a very focused view on exactly what it is they don't like. And matching those things in a future-proof way is kind of totally the problem. In terms of what we need to deliver as a MVP, I think there's an emerging idea that maybe these preferences are going to be quite a utopian format for all internet users to express the kind of things they do and don't like. I'm not sure that's useful. I know, yes, we've talked a lot about we don't want to be too Eurocentric, we don't think too much about the copyright law, but I think that a lot of the motivation for the group, I know not everyone agrees with that, but I think that's probably why most of us are here and where most of the interest in this work will come from. So we should focus on building a skeleton on which people can, people who are not in regimes who have to follow these rules can interpret them with some flexibility. We discussed this earlier, this is really helpful. People who do end up working in regimes where these rules matter, find them useful things to build laws on and then to follow the law on. And that should be the focus of the group. And deciding on what that's for will then help us determine the coarse-grained fine-grained question. It's easy for governments to say, you must follow the IETF standards unless you're doing it for accessibility purposes, in which case go ahead. And we can trust governments to make some of the decision for us. It will make our lives a lot easier.
I think a relatively coarse-grained framework, something that does include inference/RAG, have a conversation about that. The recognition that if that doesn't work out, that is a nested case of TDM, and we just default back to the TDM.
Look, I think it's important that RAG is in there. I think our preference is to continue publishing. We publish a lot of content outside of this payment, and we do that on the basis that people don't nick it. I think we're quite interested to make sure that the open web persists as a thing, and having polite rules that tell people that RAG is always allowed, use of our content, summarization of our content is always allowed in these standards is really important. So.
Okay. Yeah, so I do agree. Certainly it's a yes, whether it's fine-grained or coarse-grained, depending on what we can achieve. I think the object of defining a preference that targets value extracting substitutive uses, whether we call that summarization or RAG or inferencing, I think is something that we would want to discuss and hone down. I think recognizing that a preference always means if you ask me, I may have a different answer. So unless you ask me, I think is always implied with every single preference, where the preference after don't do it. There's always an unless after that. And also being mindful of purpose-based restrictions, which I think are too vague to be meaningful in the sense that they can change from the moment you take something to the next day and you decide you want to do something else with it. So, but yes, overall.
I'm a yes. I think we need to be very, very focused on not trying to get into the game of expressing legal or policy expressions, or trying to even worry about where we set it in, because we shouldn't be setting it in the first place. That's out of our boundary. I'm going to differ a little bit from the use expression. I think the use is maybe, in fact, focusing a little bit on how it's used or what the purpose of the use is. So remember, I don't mean purpose. The use of it, I think, is maybe where the rights, where the language needs to go. Because in the end of the day, the people who have content, who are setting these preferences, are going to focus on the use aspect of it. How are they used? Not the why they're used, but how they're used. I think they're going to focus on that, and I think the people are reading these things and looking at the content and then doing work with it. We're also going to focus on the use, and we have a lot of expertise in the room that is very deep into AI or copyright or other expressions, and we're not writing this grammar for us. We're writing it for real users. We are simply here because we represent parties that have interests in solving problems, and therefore we become experts. We don't write a spec for us, we write a spec for the users.
Paul?
Yeah,
Sorry,
I also
just to,
think that
sorry, Paul, so what does that mean for the coarse grain versus fine grain, just to make sure?
It means, I think we should do coarse with in places where it makes sense, from a place where a user would understand it, to allow us to stray a little bit into the fine, but in general, coarse is probably the better place. With the option, always, and this gentleman over here has this great idea, I support it, should always have extensibility. Always have that extensibility option that lets you do more granular if you want to.
Thank you. Sorry, Paul.
Yeah, I think on the generally like as coarse as possible, while in sort of the most likely use of this, like I know we had a discussion about obtaining yesterday, is probably people, especially on the right shoulder side, wanting to say no by default and then engaging in negotiations or making concessions for certain things. Like I think what we're targeting with a public standardized vocabulary is this first step of establishing position, and that the more fine-grained permissions afterwards will probably, maybe there's a subordinate vocabulary for that. Maybe that is, I think a lot of people have referenced that's usually the domain of private contracts that are custom made. So I think if we want something that is understandable for this first step of establishing position, we need to be relatively coarse. And sort of that means, as I said before, like we need something around drag or inference time uses, because otherwise it's getting a hole in it. But it's more on this level of, we call it techniques or like general concepts versus very specific things, like something like text and image or sort of translations, just too specific.
Sonia?
Yeah, so I think we don't think that training or inferencing in most territories globally is a copyright infringement, but we are supportive of.
Sorry, can you speak?
Oh, so we are supportive of enabling rights holders to still, for their publicly available content, remove their content for training generative AI models, and I think that's important to keep, and I think that's achievable for the MVP. I think if we want to start to extend those voluntary controls to other areas, particularly to the broader areas like inferencing, I think will have significant impact that we can't actually consider at the moment, as we haven't really fully appreciated where inferencing occurs. We need to do a full kind of audit and look at the implications before we start to create controls on those broader areas. But for the MVP at least, I think we should focus on an opt-out for generative AI.
Okay.
Get it? Coarse, simple solution that works for the majority of the publishers and also for the crawler and AI operators, because we need them to like get on board with it.
Same, I want a short crisp vocabulary that satisfies 90% of the publisher and 90%, if not 99%, of search and AI solution. After speaking with hundreds of publishers, this core vocabulary for me is limited to not found in search and Gen AI solution, not in LLM, but retrievable in Gen AI solution. Third is not in LLM, retrievable, contain no change. Fourth is not in LLM and retrievable in Gen AI solution. I think if we are able to launch these four things, all publishers that I spoke to will be okay.
That was Fabrice. Henry,
Just
did
add
you
one
want
more
to?
thing.
Yeah.
It needs to be understandable for publishers. Like it cannot be too complex because.
So, but for both of you, actually, specifically to the inference issue, where you think?
This is what I said. I think that there is clear friction on LLM. That is something in the past. This is something that is created that you cannot touch. There is people want to be excluded from that. Point number one. And then there is the level of today. Everybody wants to be in search to get traffic. In AI, there is friction there, and I think there is people that want to be visible, but no change. They don't want the text to be changed. We have some people in the room that do not want text to be changed. Okay. And second is that this need to be limited in display. Obviously, not the full recipe, not the full article, but surface because it's payroll content and we want to write type visits. And some want to be excluded completely. Okay. So again, if we support all of this, I think this will satisfy most of the publishers I spoke to, if not all publishers I spoke to. This is some of the solution we have today, I think, in terms of no cache, no archive things, that is really broad and excluding people completely or partially from display and LLM and whatever.
I think, can we go remotely?
Yeah.
Okay. Alyssa, do you want to? Do you have an opinion?
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
So I think what is both achievable here and likely to be most effective on the internet is is an approach that has a small number of categories delineated. I think in addition to the three that Paul's draft starts with, the other ones that make sense to me are the sort of search applications that we discussed yesterday, focused on linking back to the original location and faithfulness to the original content. I think an inference category makes sense. It's possible that a RAG category makes sense. These are a little bit overlapping. And I think that's about the extent of it. I think the nice thing about having both the training categories and the inference categories is if you have a content creator or publisher who says yes to training and no to inference, then that's the start of the conversation about all these other usages that people are concerned about, including accessibility and translation. So I support the person who said, simple set of categories, and then the legal jurisdiction and other norms and standards will come into play. Like, I think that's a fine way to address accessibility. I don't think saying no to inference means we have no more accessibility features. I just think that some of those things will be worked out in the presence of, or perhaps in spite of, these preferences, because they're just preferences.
Thanks, Alyssa. Brian?
Brian from Blue Sky. I largely agree. I think something on the order of like a handful of clearly delineated categories. I think not getting too hung up on a couple of the exceptions. And I think I just kind of in general being able to iterate on the entire thing in years to come.
Thank you. Leila, did you want to state an opinion?
No, nothing. No comment on my side. Thanks.
Thank you. Pierce?
Yeah, I mean, I sort of agree with what Alicia said, really. I mean, I think the existing sort of fairly coarse-grained, minimal set of sort of tokens, if you like. But yeah, I think the inference time is an important one. To sort of think, I see it as different as TDM. TDM is very general. I think inference implies that it's already being processed by the result of a trained model. And I think the thing is with RAG, I don't know if it's a helpful distinction really, but RAG basically is just is a mechanism that gets material into the inference time of an AI model. So I think the only thing is it sort of confuses people possibly is that there appears to be some sort of referencing implied, but I think, I don't know whether we can have that indicated in any way, but I think that that's what probably allowed search people saying we want to be available to be searched, because they would then be referenced back. There was a sort of reciprocity, oh god, can't say it, sorry, about the sort of, there's a sort of we'll give you something and you give us something back type of arrangement with that. But it's not necessarily implied that when you say RAG, that's you're going to have your even your name or a link back to the material. But that, I guess I don't know how we can embed that. But I think to start with, really, yeah, the basic minimum set of categorizations, that'd be good.
Thank you. That's good. Mike, I don't know if you want to have a comment with hat off, or do you want to wait till the end of the call?
I'll leave it. Thank you.
Sebastian?
Yes, I think I agree what has been said before, and want to reassert that I think that we need a minimal core approach for August, and because the vocabulary has to provide a solution to a pressing issue, so time is of essence, and it has to align with existing legal requirements today. And I think Paul Keller's draft is a good start with categories that have support from the rights holders, content creators, and it aligns with existing regulation. And then from there, we can work on extensions and enhancements as we see necessary. And if we can agree on the definitions for RAG and inference and search, that has been the issue in the past, that these definitions have not been very easy to achieve. From my perspective, and that just a last comment, the same principles apply for a reservation regarding training and a reservation regarding RAG. So when you have a sentence like, okay, the declaring party wants to express a reservation for this and that, then you can enter a definition and bind this information to the content or to the location. So I think we can, if we keep that in mind for what the purpose is of that vocabulary, then we can add and extend the minimal version later.
Thank you. Stefano, would you like to state an opinion?
Hello. No, right now I don't have any other inputs to provide.
Thank you. And Martin, like you walked in a bit later, did you want to say something?
Many things, but
Yeah, go ahead.
I don't have context. So,
I think you're talking about post-grain, like what's kind of the question.
Well, there is no sensible way that we can define grains at this point. Just
and specifically about whether we should attack the inference kind of problem.
I'm split on inference. I think there's if you put training in as one of your categories, there is obviously all of these uses that involve effectively machine learning models operating on your information. And to a large extent, I think that the TDM umbrella, if we retain that, which I think we should, would cover those applications. So I'm less concerned about inference from that perspective. I think that there's a number of people that would feel more comfortable if they were able to say, no, I want nothing to do with AI. No training, no inference, be done with it. Which is why I compressed them into the same bucket in the proposal that I put out, not really understanding all the nuance at the time. I also recognize that a lot of the applications that people have for this won't be in a position to respect those opt-outs necessarily, to the point that I raised yesterday. Thank you.
So if I can summarize what I think I've heard, it sounds like there is interest in trying to address the inference case from a large number of people. but that we have a preference to keep it coarse-grained, not to go down the each individual usage. Although we do kind of have a sense of wanting to try to keep extensibility open, so that down the road we can add that granularity if it becomes necessary. And this is, I think, similar to the discussion we had yesterday about search, in that there seems to be interest in trying to address search cases, and we need to get more specificity around that and figure out what that looks like. And so I think what we need at this point now is concrete proposals from people of what would those vocabulary definitions for search and for the inference time things look like. Is it one term? Is it a number of terms? How do you describe them? How do they slot into Paul's draft if we end up adopting that? And so I don't just think it's probably, we're getting to diminishing returns on this in this meeting. Crafting fine proposals is seldom a good use of meeting time. But what we need to do next then is to have people go away and write those proposals, something that could slide into the document we're proposing to adopt, that we can then talk about on the mailing list, and as we'll discuss tomorrow, probably in future meetings. So with that, and they can be emails to the list, or they can be internet drafts. I think if it's more substantial, an internet draft is appreciated but not required. If folks need help writing internet drafts, we have a number of people who can help you doing that. But it's not, again, it's not required. Yes, Larry.
So are you suggesting we shouldn't? I thought I heard us say yesterday we were going to build off of Paul's. At least yesterday we were talking we would accept Paul's draft and build off that draft. You suggested
we would call for adoption.
We in the IETF we never make decisions in meetings. It always has to be confirmed in the list. Yes. So I'm just dancing around that. No, that's all I'm doing. Yes. My assumption is we will adopt Paul's draft, but I cannot say that certainly right.
So if that were to happen,
yes,
then we don't need necessarily another draft. The work would take place in that draft.
It could, sure. It could be a pull request against that draft. But often, if it's a self-contained idea and you want to elaborate, an internet draft is a useful way to make that proposal.
Even if we throw it away.
Right.
Oh, I'm trying to
understand. We might
Right.
take that idea from that document, move it in.
Exactly. Right. Internet drafts are often disposable documents. It's just a proposal, and it's a slightly more formal way of making a proposal. Not in any way required.
I'm just trying to understand the process.
Right. You can equally put your proposal in an email. It's just that internet draft gives it a little more structure.
Totally. Thank you.
No worries.
I have one procedural comment. Like, I think if people make proposals, it would be helpful if they were also looking at sort of existing systems, right? Like, we're standardized or attempting to standardize a field where there is already systems that operate in this place. And the more we align with, for example, you have an inference thing in CP2A. I think the IPCP plus people have something. The more we stay close to what's in there, the more likely whatever we come up with actually is going to have a standardizing effect, because we're not operating on a completely blank field.
Right.
Yeah, I think like part of the thing is like if somebody makes a proposal, if you know of an implementation, like talk about it, right? I think that's kind of how we come out on the discussion, because it's kind of unrealistic to expect everybody to know that these things exist, because a lot of like the people who are coming into this are fairly new.
With the one note that we have to be careful not to infringe upon somebody. They have a standard, but it may be encumbered by IP issues, and that we can't just steal it from the sake of.
And this goes back to the discussion yesterday around the copyright terms. If you make a proposal, contribution to this process, you are making assertions about copyright for that proposal. So make sure you understand what you're doing when you do that.
Yes. Make sure you have the rights to say it, being contributed.
I think the idea then would be that folks go away and do that over the next couple of weeks, and hopefully we get some proposals in whatever form they take over the next few weeks. If you do send it just an email, please mark it conspicuously as a proposal for the inference term or for the search term or whatever it is, so that we can see that flagged. We'll discuss that on list, and then we'll talk tomorrow about the potential for future meetings, and the hope is we'll converge and go through this process again. Just for the information of the chairs and for the folks in the room, this is in no way a commitment, but is anybody willing to say they're interested in making such a proposal now, either for search or for inference? Is anybody thinking about doing that? A couple.
Leonard, Yari,
Ted?
for the minutes. Sure.
Yeah.
Leonard, Yari, and Ted raise their hands.
Okay.
I already have one on search.
Martin has one, so you can
But I'm
grab that. Yeah.
I think Ted's definition ultimately turns out to be better, so we should talk to it.
The crucial thing is not just make a proposal that, gives a string, but actually define what does that mean? Like define on
Yes,
the receiving
yes.
end of that, what
Right.
is excluded and what is.
Right, it's how it gets denoted in the protocol is the least interesting part, and if you call it foo, that's fine for now. The important part is the description of, which may be a number of paragraphs below that. Yeah.
Can we get that into a GitHub so we can all do requests against it? That'd be really helpful.
There is a GitHub version.
There is.
When you say it, what do you mean?
The GitHub, just this proposal. That
Yes, so they'll decide how to.
GitHub thing, not just the late things or singing.
We decided not to use GitHub as a canonical form of information in this working group. So I think we'll find some way to make sure there's a list of the proposals. Where that list lives, we'll figure that out. And if you have an existing proposal that an existing draft that covers one of these cases, just bring it to our attention.
Yeah. So I think if we do end up taking Paul's draft, that would be the natural time to sort of capture the alternatives.
We'll have an
that we
issue.
have on that one. We'll
Yeah.
have an issue, and,
Yeah.
and what we don't have one of those now. Just send an email to the list.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
Maybe with a
think,
draft link in it. That would work better.
And I think like Alyssa pointed out before, like Tom's draft on the call, but his draft also has some things in there that will probably get pulled out, maybe.
Mhm.
Or something.
And so I think then that gives us a path forward for this search discussion and for the inference discussion, including RAG and what have you. The thing that I wanted to touch on quickly after this is if we look back at that list of vocabulary issues, we've talked about search and RAG, the first two now. We've circled around the TDM issue a couple of times. And if I read the discussion so far, my interpretation is that there's an inclination to keep the TDM term in Paul's draft, at least for now. I think people have some reservations about it, but that seems to be the leanings that we may revisit that. We talked about the interface to attachment. At the bottom, there's the two kind of pair of issues of the spam filtering, offensive language, and other good uses versus weapons and biometrics and other bad uses. And if I replay the discussion we had this morning about granularity and the concerns about getting fine-grained, I think that kind of leads me to think we're leaning towards not trying to address those now. Because then we're getting into the purpose, use, action kind of potential rat hole that is unrealistic in the time frame we're talking about for this draft. And so I would tentatively propose that we're not going to talk about those now in this cycle for this initial deliverable, but that we still, in the back of our minds, want to assure that we create a framework that is capable of being extended to address those in the future. And so we need to have some thought put into how we can have reasonable assurances that we're going to be able to do that down the road.
You push the Q button or you want my hand?
Go ahead.
On the time issues, I think getting into the depth of time stuff, I agree not to deal with now. However, I do think.
Sorry, when you say time issues, what do you mean?
Well, you have time dimensions up there on the list.
Oh, yes, I haven't gotten to that yet.
I'm sorry, I've got it out of order time-wise on a time discussion, so I'll hold until you get there and then I'll have a time.
Okay. So am I reading the room correctly? Does that seem reasonable for those bottom two issues? I see nodding heads for the record. Okay. That leaves us with a we have a plan for a lot of these issues, which is good. The Eurocentricity, I am thinking of as a largely editorial issue, at least to start with. I think we want to see the draft iterate a few times, and then we can revisit and see how comfortable we are with, how Eurocentric it remains. Does that make sense?
I suggested changing to an exemplary language rather than a canonical language. I think that's one thing. And I think the useful thing would be if some other jurisdiction comes up with something in a reasonable time frame that we can add it in to make it less Eurocentric. But it may or may not happen.
It is largely an artifact of that being a result of European discussion. This is not something that will disappear as we head into that release.
Right.
Yeah, I think it's mostly editorial. The one thing is that adopting this TDM term,
Definition.
because that is coming from the new regulation, but maybe it's the right thing to do.
I think
But TDM is not only European, right? Like Singapore uses that thing, Japan uses that concept of it.
It's escaped into the wild.
It is sort of like we copy the definition, but the term itself is broader than in Europe.
And I mean I don't have an opinion, we can keep it, but I think the point is also that the term comes from an area that was before AI. So maybe it's actually useful to find something else which fits our needs a little bit better, or maybe it's useful to use this term because it's one. I don't know.
I think the use of the term comes from the fact that there's a number of entities like jurisdictions around the world who have this in their codes, their words, and this is, I think, commonly agreed that it has at least some overlap with AI, and so it is a term that we need to, for reasons of clarity, how it relates to these legal concepts, we will need to deal with it. You can, I'm pretty convinced, after having worked on this for more than 1.5 years, you cannot sort of build a sort of vocabulary for what we're trying to achieve and simply not mention TDM.
I mean, you can mention it, right? But you don't have to use it as one of the categories. And I think it's a term from copyright, right? So I don't think we have to have the one match to copyright. Maybe it's even beneficial to avoid this. But again, I don't have an opinion. I think
again, those jurisdictions around the world were trying to build sort of regulatory frameworks for the use of copyright works in AI, do so by leveraging the concept of TDM. And I don't think we can ignore that. Yeah, this doesn't.
We should also focus on it. So I don't think that we should ignore it, but we shouldn't. It should not be the centerpiece of what we are coming up with. And I think that it's that if any jurisdiction has a very significant presence in the in our approach, I think that is problematic. It doesn't matter which jurisdiction is doing what. It matters what sort of practices are happening in the industry around the world and global, because there are some jurisdictions that have no opinions, and we cannot, we should prevent, we have this term, we call it Brussels effect. So I think that we should, as much as possible, and it's not, I don't think it's only editorial, as much as possible, we need to avoid, we need to prevent that kind of thing, to show that there is a Brussels effect in this vocabulary that we are coming up with. And I say that about any jurisdiction.
So I think the problem that you point to, we're not wanting to extend this approach, is one that can be solved by simply people who are not, this vocabulary again is preference. It signals a preference to a very broad concept that may have legal backing in some jurisdictions, it may not enough. Those in others can ignore them, right? You can just say I'm sort of just not sort of people who make this very broad fantastical claims that there is some kind of legal context which forces me to comply, to basically stop each and every operation of the computer at the request of rights holder is a silly idea, and therefore I will just not comply with it. But I may be amendable to complying with a much more targeted concern about training a generative AI model using works as input for generative AI model. The moment where you remove that concept from the vocabulary, so like I think to the degree where we say we built on this draft, like if we're going to the point where we're saying like it's not the central thing, but it's the out, like it's the encompassing thing. If we're removing that, then we're not building on that drafting. Like the idea is that in order for this to make it workable, to also function in legal contexts which have this concept, for better or worse, you will need to also have that concept included in the vocabulary. Otherwise, the vocabulary will not work in those things, and people who want to avail themselves to the rights that they have in these jurisdictions will need to use something else, which defies the idea of building like a university usable vocabulary.
So I think you need something that is kind of roughly similar to this concept. It doesn't have to be a one-to-one mapping. You can still, it has to fit our needs, and you can then still explain in the draft what's the difference, how it maps, why we use the different concepts. So it's like you need something that is similar to roughly what's there in the frameworks, but it doesn't have to be one-to-one.
I think it's more harmful, Maria, if you actually make a different one and start explaining differences to a specific jurisdiction. I think it's more harmful that way, at least personally speaking.
I feel confusion. Right. I feel like we're getting to diminishing returns in this discussion. What I'd suggest is we keep an issue open, and we see. Paul, I think the editors are going to do some work to remove the Eurocentricity from the draft as much as possible. We'll keep an eye on it, and we'll try and articulate what the discomforts are with it, and see if we can come to. We will revisit it over time.
I think Brad had a comment last time.
Yes.
It's a related point, and I think it's soluble, and I agree with Paul that we should not, we can't avoid using TDM just because of its importance of its use for opting out of exceptions that are becoming less common around the world. But there is, I think, an understanding of what it covers or doesn't cover that. Because we're now using it in connection with particular jurisdictions, that will be important for us to clarify the way that it's used in the context of this preference. And that might mean saying that, TDM is used in this context means X in addition to, so that there is clarity. If we are going to be using this nesting idea where opting out of TDM essentially means opting out of everything that's in the bucket, that doesn't necessarily map to the understanding of what some believe TDM covers in legal contexts, such as specific forms of inferencing, where it's not just about analyzing data and information, it's about reproducing content, exact replicas, and that sort of thing, which is most likely outside of what text and data mining itself in and of itself means. So it probably sounds a bit precious, but I think that we should just consider how we reflect that in the final vote.
And then one of the other issues we haven't discussed yet is the nesting hierarchy. So I think some people expressed some discomfort with the hierarchy of the terms, and perhaps the implication that one encompasses the other. Martin, you had an alternative illustration the other day, I think, when we were talking about search, and that kind of touched on that a little bit, although maybe that's a little different.
So I can talk to that now, or I can respect the queue. Which would you prefer?
Do we have a queue?
Yeah, Gladys.
Before we move on with Q&A, I want to comment on this discussion. One of the concerns I have with either Eurocentric, it's not specifically around Eurocentricity, it's centered around any particular regime of where this discussion has already happened, but maybe not entirely in the context of AI, is that if we are not careful, we will find ourselves pulling in policy decisions and potentially even existing law decisions that have been made in courts that maybe don't really apply to what we're working on, but they're tangential. And so sometimes coming up with new terminology, or TDM even at that level, simply say, we're not going to use the TDM term, we're going to use this new term, frees us up from past decisions that have already been settled in business negotiations or in court decisions. Sometimes we like them, sometimes we don't like them, but if we want to be fresh, sometimes just becoming a new term, even if it's for an old art, can be very helpful at setting the ground fresh and clean, untouched stone. But then we can proceed from. So just my caution is, let's be conscious of that. We may not always want to drag things in that have already been discussed and resolved, because we may not like some of those decisions that have already previously been made. They may not be helpful.
Do you want to share? Do you want to share the picture, or do you want to just?
I can put the picture up on the screen again. Why don't we do that? It's a terrible picture. Something I want here for it. All slots for the requested media are already taken.
I'm pressing green screen. I'm pressing green screen.
No, you need to stop sharing your own. Because apparently that's how this works.
Shining example of IETF technology at work, yes.
Right.
For the non-IT people in the room, MeetEcho continues to evolve, and every time we use it, it's changed a little bit from the last time we used it. So we're always learning.
It's often better. So I think the key thing to realize here is that there are uses that are strict subsets of other uses. So if we're talking about generative AI training, then generative AI training is a strict subset of the general class of AI training. And that's a useful construct, particularly when it comes to thinking about these more granular uses that we might define in the future, because it means if they are a strict subset of another one, the preferences that people have expressed regarding the other one apply. And also for the people who are consuming that content, understanding that their particular usage, whether it be for translation or what have you, is a strict subset of some higher level category. Therefore, they should respect those preferences at that higher layer. However, we also have to recognize that there are no clean delineations that allow us to say that search is a strict subset of influence, or search is a strict subset of AI training, because of the fact that that particular application is more complex. And so we have to, I think there is a useful thing in having nesting as a concept within our tool set, so that we can build out toward more granular expressions in the future should we need to. But it is not something that we should rely on exclusively. And I say this, TDM and inference, I'm not sure like one's a strict subset of the other necessarily, which is part of why I hold reservations about inference. But that's something that we need to work through in all of this. I put it inside TDM, I'm not sure that that's strictly true. But it may be useful for us to use those sorts of nesting structures without, while recognizing that they have these limitations.
Right. And so I at this point, I think the useful discussion to have is, do we have rough agreement in the room that that's approximately the right approach, that the nesting hierarchy is something that is a useful, if limited tool,
if it works,
that we need to continuously evaluate as we're creating the vocabulary and fine-tuning it to make sure that it's appropriate in each case? Or do we have, what I'm, I guess, most interested in is someone pushing back and saying, no, we shouldn't be using this at all.
Clarification, this is not nesting, this is overlapping sets.
No, but there is nesting there.
Sure.
In a couple of places, right? So you have to recognize that there is nesting,
right,
but not everything will be strictly nested inside another thing, and there's overlaps.
Right.
Let's
not wrap ourselves around the actual terminology. Let's just say set theory, like set theory.
No hierarchy. I mean, there's overlapping sets, but I'm
Sure.
not convinced there's a hierarchy.
Well, there are strict subsets.
I'm not sure about that.
Well, there
And
is,
I don't think
because
it's
generative
useful.
AI is a strict subset of AI.
As
Therefore,
it's
you-
defined in the current vocabulary, I think you were right, like you're riffing off
Right.
the proposal, right? Like, and there's another study, I raised my hand, like this keeps making the point that you made after I raised my hand, that I'm also not sure if inference is necessarily a subset of TDM, because like I think there is forms of inference that probably do not meet the sort of legal definition of TDM.
Right.
And that is something to, like how, like I think that's, from my perspective, that's the real sort of open question in the nesting discussion. Like for the rest, I guess there is nested things, like some things are defined as subsets of other things, and some things are really overlapping. Like I think the search discussion that we had yesterday, where we said you have the 4 complements of different types of search, so it was actually very well depicted there by.
Yeah, so I think that we also may be able to say that inference, for our purposes, is a strict subset of TDM, and exclude those ones that are not. And that may be something that we can do while recognizing that the definition of the thing that we have doesn't necessarily coordinate with, like, precisely correspond to what people have in their heads. That may be something that we can do, understanding, of course, that whenever you do that, you create problems that you then have to think about managing.
I don't think we can say that as such. It is a subset, like it depends on how we define inference, if it can be conceptualized as a.
Right.
Yeah.
So, but I don't think saying one is a subset of another is a constraint is useful in any way. Like even
It is. My point was that it allows you to build a system where people can express their opinions at a higher level and have them apply to the more specific application that we have not yet specified.
So the thing here is why we did this, right? Like, is people have the right to say no to the at least in the EU. That is a very broad concept. Like, I think we want and somebody who's doing a specific thing, developing training a generative AI model, you need to understand that that is sort of like that is encompassed by the bigger concept of TDM, and in this case also from AI training. So like that allows you, the nesting allows you to translate to have an answer about more specific use cases if the preferences have been expressed in a less specific way. You can define like, okay, in this case, like somebody said, no AI training. Like if this drawing was the final thing, it would be like, yes, I can still do inference, but I cannot do Gen AI because Gen AI is nested in AI training. Inference isn't inside it, so there's no expression being made that applies to the inference use case. So some concept of nesting is necessary. I don't think we can get around it. Like we played with this idea of having like everything on the same thing and then you can target each of the things independently, but that would leave like unanswered questions.
But I mean, I think this is okay to have some room for interpretation that if these are preferences, right? So if you read them, you still need to make a decision what you do with them. So that gives some room for interpretation. Today, for Gen AI, it's the case that you need a trained AI model to generate something out of it. So this is kind of technically there's a precondition to it, but like preferences you want to express are 2 different things. I just want to say I don't want my data to be used to generate some new content, which is like the thing that is more independent than generally saying I don't want my data to be used for DNA training.
But that's what we just said. I just said like you can address inference. Like I don't want use my data as input for an AI model is indeed independent from expression. That's why that is not nested within AI training.
Yeah,
I think we're going into.
I think we're going into too much detail, but I think like the higher point areas, like some of these combinations may or may not make sense, right? Like so, if you look at it, somebody might want to have a more coarse thing allowed and a smaller thing not allowed, or vice versa. Like some of them may not make sense, but like I don't think the vocabulary can stop that. The point I wanted to make was like how we define these things has an implication on how we combine things, right? Like if you look at Martin was like, I think like you're throwing up like 3 like more specific or like most recent or like most restrictive kind of thing.
Most restrictive is the combination model that I'm.
Right, like so I think if you think of like more specific, then like if things are not strictly nested, then it becomes hard to even sustain that model, right? Because you don't know what is most like specific, right? At this point, if you draw a picture like this, right?
You're right. It is most specific first.
Right, like so I think I just wanted to throw that up as an item for discussion, like how we combine these things if we have some kind of not strictly nested set of things.
Yeah.
Right, like, so, yeah, that's pretty much it. Thanks. Alyssa?
So I think the overall universe of things that we're talking about here is very small. So this diagram doesn't have RAG in it, but if it did, then there would be like 6 things: TDM, AI training, Gen AI training, search, inference, and RAG. And I think the question we should be asking is like, what, if we're going for simplicity, like what makes these simple to use for the average person who wants to express their preference? And I'm not really convinced that the nesting makes these simpler to use. It sounds like it actually makes them more complicated to use. And I also feel like we can achieve the same thing as nesting achieves by having really clear definitions of what each of these means if they're not nested. I agree with Suresh that if they're not nested, then you do away with this specificity rule, but you can accomplish the same thing there by being very specific about what it means for them to be composed. And if there's only 6 of them, there's not that many combinations. So you could be quite specific about that as well. So I guess, I mean, I see like conceptually it's fun to sit here and think about which of these are subsets of the other, but I don't know that trying to maintain the nesting actually makes this overall framework easier to use. It might actually be easier to not try to force that and just focus on how do we define these terms such that your average user can understand them and know, oh yeah, I want to say allow or disallow to each of them.
So we're going to cut the queue of the people on it, if we can go through those relatively quickly. I think that this is a discussion that we'll just need to continue on because we haven't built the whole vocabulary yet. We're already talking about adding a few things to it. It's something we'll need to evaluate over time. So
I have just one question of clarification to Alyssa. I can see, are you talking about both levels of nesting that are in here? Because like I can see your point about Gen AI and AI training being nested, but TDM, as broadly defined as it is, that the other things are nested within TDM. Like I don't see how you can express, you would need to describe everything of TDM which is not any of the other 5 categories, which seems to be like, I think that's impossible in the end.
But that's because you have a nice clear definition of what TDM is already. So you can just use that.
Yeah, and but the nice clear definition of TDM, which we have because the European legislator provided us one, is of such a nature that all of, or most of the other things clearly fall within it, are subsets of that. So that's where the original nesting, like, so the first level nesting of having everything within the TDM container comes from.
I'm not sure if that's true.
Right, I guess, like, if that's true, then fine. Maybe it's nice to say the big umbrella here is TDM, and the other 5 things are subsets of that. But I also hear people saying, well, maybe inference isn't a strict subset of TDM, in which case it becomes complicated. So I guess what I'm saying is, like, it doesn't feel like it needs to be forced, and we already have overlaps between these categories. And I think the important thing is that each of these conceptually is that the user can distinguish them from each other in such a way that they're meaningful to make a decision about allow or disallow.
Thank you. Timid Robot?
My name is Timid Robot. I think that we are going to find that there are kind of undeniable subsets. We don't have to make a goal of creating a hierarchy, but if we try to deny that hierarchy, I think we're going to end up with a vocabulary that is incredibly verbose and far more difficult to use. I also think that the hierarchy has a lot of value in being able to describe generics so that people can use the power of those generics without having to specify each and every single specific, right? And so if, as an example, like generative AI covers a lot of different specifics. If we say that there's no hierarchy, each one of those specifics will have to be enumerated. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Paul, are you still in line or?
You kept me like, yeah, I just want to second that I think that is very useful.
Okay. Good.
Yeah, so I got in to talk about extensibility, which I think has been mentioned in the chat in a couple of ways, and I strongly agree that if you don't have some form of relationship among the terms, then expressing what you want gets more and more difficult as the number of terms goes up. And we saw this very, very much in language tagging, when I used to have to express it where a cluster like NUK TOCME was like a completely different thing than EN-US, right? They weren't related at all in the registry originally, and now they're composed. So if you want to express something that's just about English, use EN and we're done. Here, I think we can get to the point where people want to express something about AI and they don't really care whether it's Gen AI, which already covers a bunch of things, or DeepSeek's newly announced Hyper AI. They don't have to go back and redo their statements, some of which may already be in containers that are out there in the world. So I think some level of relationship that allows the expressions to be at a higher order is going to be useful for extensibility in the long term and for utility when people are passing out data that just goes out into the wild and doesn't have this, I can check the updated graph.
Okay, so it sounds like that's a discussion that we'll need to continue as we develop the vocabulary. Then the next issue that we identified that's on the list is what is AI and the definitional questions around that, which it's almost lunchtime.
Could we knock off my time comment?
We're getting there. We're getting
simple.
We're getting there. I don't think we want to talk about that in the room today. I think that's something that's going to need some thought and perhaps proposals by people as we move on. I'm loath to start that discussion at 12:05. Then the next one is the mapping to preferences, which I think is the concept being that right now we have this vocabulary, but not actually expressing a preference. It's not no or yes. It's just that. And I think based upon our discussion about that interface to attachment, that will come as part of that. So we'll look for proposals around that, either from the editors or from other parties, and that will happen as we move on. And so I don't think that requires discussion right now. And then we get to the time dimension. You're welcome to make a comment, but I think this is something that we really need to discuss as part of attachment, not as part of the vocabulary. Do you disagree with that?
Maybe the particular comment I'm going to make
Okay.
it simply is, I want to make sure that we include in the vocabulary a statement of when the policy has been set, a timestamp, if you will, or a timing value. But when we're diving these things, we can know when it was applied.
And so, I mean, just from an engineering standpoint, I think the natural place for that to happen is it's attachment mechanism specific. It's not generic in the vocabulary.
Agreed. Sure. So, why? Can you explain the logic of why it's attachment specific?
Because the mechanism of attachment and how it's associated with the content is different in each case. It's embedded in the content. It's in metadata around the content. It's location based rather than.
But the policy is presumably a level above the content. Like if I had a website and 100 pieces of media on that website, and at 1 minute past midnight I set that policy, but I upload the pieces of media all the different times, then the attachment will all happen at different times, and the attachment of the preference to the content. So there should be one timestamp, they should all be the same.
Well, that depends on whether you're using what we call location-based or unit-based attachment models.
Right.
In other words, if all you're doing is setting one thing like at your site level, then the content's irrelevant. It's not, I'd say, detached from the content.
Right.
I think there's two pieces. One is the one timestamp I wanted was, I'm setting this policy, it's Tuesday, January 4th.
I understand.
The second timestamp could be when, for a particular piece of content, when that got attached. I'm not going to even argue that right now. But in the policies version, and to Mark's point, the reason I'm saying it should be in here is that my tools for evaluating the policy will pull up all these various fields in the policy. That tool should also look at a policy expression and pull up the timing of when the person who set the policy set that policy.
Oh, the queue is reopened, so you can have the queue now.
Policy either exists or doesn't exist. It doesn't matter like where to start it to exist.
Or what?
If you can get the policy, it is there. It exists and you have to apply it. It doesn't matter since when it's there.
Maria, can you get in the queue if you're going to have a discussion? Martin.
So we're genuinely discussing this right now?
It sounds like.
We have 20 minutes for lunch.
So we're lunch.
Maybe I should filibuster so that I'm serious.
Yeah.
Make a call.
So I think what I would like to see is what is the import of having the date? What's the use case? How does that affect the consumption of the vocabulary to the degree that it's necessary to promote it into the vocabulary? So perhaps if you have interest here, maybe could you write a use cases and requirements around this?
What I'm wondering is that as we're doing this, maybe what we need to do then is take to the process of as we're proposing the vocabularies outside of this meeting today.
Mm-hmm.
And to put a proposal into the proposed vocabulary.
That's what I'm asking you.
Yeah. But outside this meeting, not today.
Yes, yes. I'm not asking you to go during lunch and write something. Yeah.
Martin, did you want to make a short statement on
Yeah,
why?
what I wanted to say is that I would oppose putting anything like this in the vocabulary. I think it would be a mistake. I think that we can model everything as effectively unit attachments with some caveats, some location-based ones that will allow us to proceed. And therefore, it becomes, if you have the content, you have the expressions effectively. And then once you have that, there is no time limit on those things. And if you have a time limit on it, it doesn't expire. It doesn't revert back to an unknown state. Laws will work all those things out, and that there may be time limits in law about the expression of preferences, just like there is in copyright. But that's not our business to do that. And we stand the risk of making this far more complicated as a result of doing something with time. And I would rather not.
So if I understand what you're saying, but I don't think that's what Glenn proposed. I don't think he was talking about, I think he was talking about more about a freshness thing, like a timestamp on when it was created, not like how long it's valid for.
Yep.
I think there are different things. I'm sure we can disagree.
I understand what he wants. Okay. I absolutely do not.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
I don't even understand what I want most of the time, so I love this.
Thank you.
You just start hanging together.
Thanks, Paul.
I totally don't understand what you want. Like, this is a vocabulary of use cases that will serve as targets for specific attachment scenarios, and there is no time dimension to it other than the moment where we agree on the vocabulary and we publish the vocabulary, and then time components are the attachment mechanism thing and not a vocabulary thing. Like, time has no place in this.
Makes sense. Okay.
Unless I really,
I said I wouldn't debate it right now, so I'm not debating it right now.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean I'm agreeing with you, just means I'm not debating it.
But I hear you saying you're going to try and make a proposal, a more structured proposal, so as a basis for discussion.
Next, Joe.
I think without wanting to preference a capture discussion, it would be great to see use cases of when the time would affect the crawler's decision on how to ingest the data or whether or not to ingest the data. Because in the minute, I think echoing Ridge's point, the policy is there, policy can be read at the time of reading, and it's not clear how any timing affects it. But we'd love to hear your use cases as well.
Thank you.
Make my life hard. I don't want to respond so hard.
Thank you. I think we exhausted the queue.
Okay, great.
Break for lunch?
Almost. The one other thing I wanted to do, what we talked about people potentially making proposals for the RAG inference time kind of vocabulary. Similarly for search, is anybody willing to say that they're interested without making a commitment in making proposals around the search vocabulary?
Wait, I thought you asked for search before.
Yeah, you asked for both.
Oh, okay, so that was both?
Yeah,
I'm
you
sorry,
covered
I forgot that. Okay, so that covered both of them then. Okay, good. Then I think we can break for lunch. Let's come back at 1:15, I would say. So remote folks, the Meet Echo for the afternoon session, which will resume in 1 hour, is a different link. I'll put it in the chat, and it's also on the mailing list.
It's also on the meetings tab.
And it's also in the meetings tab. Okay, see you all in an hour.
Wow.
I might as well leave this one since we're going to use a different. Hey, that's cool. That's cool and normal.
This is Microsoft's fault. It's just updating the browser.